Somewhere in the dust of what is now Pakistan and northwest India, buried under thousands of years of silence, are the remains of cities that should not exist. Not because they're old, though they are. Not because they're large, though they absolutely are. But because of what's inside them, and more importantly, what isn't. No mass graves, no burned districts, no walls built to keep armies out, no stockpiles of spears or shields, no monuments to kings or conquerors, just streets, perfectly straight streets. Drainage systems more sophisticated than anything Europe would build for another 3,000 years. Bricks. And this is the part that genuinely stops archaeologists in their tracks. Standardized bricks. Every single one cut to the exact same proportions across cities hundreds of miles apart. A civilization that clearly knew what it was doing, and then, quietly, it was gone. This is the Indus Valley Civilization, sometimes called the Harappan Civilization, and it is one of the strangest, most compelling, most unsettling mysteries in all of human history. At its peak around 4,500 years ago, it covered an area larger than ancient Egypt and Mesopotamia combined. It was home to somewhere between 1 and 5 million people. It had writing, trade networks that stretched to Mesopotamia, and urban planning so precise that modern engineers still study it with genuine admiration. And for reasons we still do not fully understand, it declined, transformed, dispersed, and effectively vanished from the historical record. No conquest we can clearly identify, no obvious collapse event, just a slow, strange fading. Now before we go any further, something important. This video is not going to pretend we have all the answers, because we don't. Nobody does. The Indus script has never been fully deciphered. The people who built these cities left us no clear written history, no list of kings, no battle records, no foundation myths we can read. What they left us are the cities themselves, and those cities are speaking in a language that archaeologists are still learning how to hear. So what we're going to do together is follow the evidence carefully, look at what we can say with reasonable confidence, acknowledge where the mysteries genuinely remain, and try to understand what kind of people could have built something so extraordinary. Because the clues are everywhere if you know where to look, in the width of those streets, in the placement of the drains, in the way the neighborhoods were organized, in the sheer scale of engineering that required coordination across an entire civilization, and in the almost total absence of the things that dominate every other ancient civilization we know, the weapons, the fortresses, the symbols of power and violence. How does a society build cities this precise? How does it sustain them for centuries, maybe longer? And how does something that enormous, that organized, that clearly functional, disappear so completely that we essentially forgot it existed until 1921? That's what we're here to figure out. Before we start, though, I want to know where you're listening from right now. Drop a comment with your city and the time you're watching. Seriously, it doesn't matter if it's 3 in the morning in Melbourne or a Tuesday lunch break in Chicago or somewhere quiet in between. Every time I check the comments on these videos, it feels like opening a window onto the whole world at once, and I genuinely love it. So tell me where you are. Now, let's go back. Back past every empire you were ever taught in school, past Rome and Greece and Egypt at its height, to a civilization that built something remarkable, left almost no trace of violence anywhere in the record, and then stepped quietly off the stage of history. The question is why? To understand what these cities were, you first have to understand the world they were born into. Because nothing about the Indus Valley Civilization makes sense in isolation. It emerged from a specific landscape, at a specific moment, shaped by forces that were as much geological and meteorological as they were human. And once you see that context, the civilization starts to feel less like a mystery and more like an inevitability. A natural outcome of the right people finding themselves in exactly the right place at exactly the right time. Cast your mind back roughly 5,000 years. The Bronze Age is in full swing across the ancient world. In Mesopotamia, the Sumerians are building ziggurats, inventing bureaucracy, and fighting each other with impressive regularity. In Egypt, the pharaohs are consolidating power, raising monuments and leaving very detailed records of who conquered whom and why everyone should be grateful for it. In the Aegean, the early foundations of what will become Greek civilization are beginning to take shape. The world, in other words, is getting complicated. Trade networks are stretching across deserts and seas. Metals are changing warfare. Writing systems are emerging in multiple places simultaneously, as if the sheer density of human activity had finally demanded a better way to keep track of things. And right there in that same window of time in the northwestern corner of the Indian subcontinent, something else is happening entirely. Something quieter. Something that, based on the archaeological record, seems to have followed a very different set of rules. The geography here matters enormously. Picture the landscape. To the northwest, the Hindu Kush and Karakoram mountain ranges forming natural corridors and barriers simultaneously. To the east and southeast, the vast expanse of what will eventually become the Indian heartland. And threading through the middle of all of it, two river systems that between them created some of the most agriculturally productive land on Earth. The Indus River and its tributaries running roughly south through what is now Pakistan, and to the east the Ghaggar-Hakra river system, sometimes identified with the legendary Saraswati of ancient texts, running through what is now northwestern India and into the Thar Desert. These rivers were everything. They flooded seasonally, depositing rich alluvial soil across their floodplains the same way the Nile did for Egypt. They provided water for crops in a landscape that could otherwise be brutally arid. They served as highways, moving goods and people across distances that would have been nearly impassable overland. And they were fed by something that made this entire region unusual on the global stage: the South Asian monsoon. The monsoon is not just rain, it is a seasonal restructuring of the entire atmosphere over the subcontinent, pulling moisture off the Indian Ocean and dumping it inland in a pattern that is, on geological timescales, remarkably predictable. 4,000 to 5,000 years ago, that monsoon appears to have been stronger and more reliable than it is today, pushing rainfall further north and west than it currently reaches, greening landscapes that are now desert, filling rivers that have since run dry. The Ghaggar-Hakra system, for instance, was almost certainly a robust perennial river during the height of the Harappan period. Today, it barely exists. This is the kind of detail that matters when you're trying to understand why cities rose here and why they may have struggled later. But we'll get to that. The other geographic factor was trade. The Indus region sat at the intersection of routes connecting the Iranian plateau to the west, Central Asia to the north, and the Indian interior to the east and south. Goods moved through these corridors continuously. Lapis lazuli from Afghanistan, tin from Central Asia, cotton and sesame from the Indus plains. There's even evidence, direct evidence in the form of Harappan artifacts found in Mesopotamian archaeological sites, that this civilization was trading all the way to the Persian Gulf and beyond. These weren't isolated people stumbling across some fertile floodplain. They were plugged into a Bronze Age world economy. Now, a word about names, because this is where things get slightly complicated and slightly misleading if you're not careful. When people say Indus Valley Civilization, they are technically using a geographic label based on where the first major sites were identified. When they say Harappan Civilization, they're using the name of Harappa, one of the two great cities excavated first, as a stand-in for the whole culture. And when archaeologists divide the period into early Harappan, mature Harappan, and late Harappan phases, they're describing stages of development that span roughly 1,000 years, from about 3,300 BCE to around 1,300 BCE, with the urban peak concentrated between roughly 2,600 and 1,900 BCE. The problem is that none of these names are what the people themselves used. We don't know what they called their civilization, their cities, or themselves. The script they left behind has never been deciphered. So every label we use is our label, imposed from the outside, shaped by the accidents of which site got dug up first, and what the excavators decided to name it. That's worth keeping in mind, because it means we're already at one remove from the actual people. We're working with our categories, not theirs. This is something archaeologists deal with constantly, and it shapes how the entire story gets built. Because there are no written king lists here, no royal annals, no foundation myths to tell you what happened when. What there is layers, quite literally. When you excavate a site that was occupied for centuries, you're reading time vertically. Deeper layers are older, changes in pottery styles, in building techniques, in the types of goods found at a site, in the density and organization of settlement patterns. All of these become the data. Archaeology, at its best, is a kind of forensic reconstruction. You find what people left behind without meaning to, the broken pots, the food residues, the abandoned tools, the structure of the streets, and you try to work backwards to the lives that produced all of it. For the Harappan world, that reconstruction has been ongoing since those first excavations in the 1920s, and it has been consistently surprising. Survey work using satellite imaging and ground-level survey has now identified somewhere between 1,000 and 1,500 Harappan sites scattered across a geographic area that stretches from the foothills of the Himalayas in the north to the Gujarat coast in the south, and from the edge of the Iranian plateau in the west to the upper Ganges plain in the east. That is not a small regional culture. That is a civilization with a footprint comparable to anything the ancient world produced. And here is where the paradox starts to sharpen. Because when you map all those sites, when you look at the two great urban centres of Mohenjo-daro and Harappa, and the dozens of smaller cities and towns and villages that surrounded them, what you see is a society of extraordinary organisational complexity. Grain storage at industrial scale, standardised weights and measures across the entire network, urban planning so consistent between cities separated by hundreds of miles that it implies either constant communication, centralised authority, or some shared set of cultural norms so deeply embedded that they functioned like law without needing enforcement. And yet, combing through the material record that this civilization left behind, archaeologists keep running into the same strange silence. Weapons exist, certainly, but not in the quantities or concentrations you'd expect from a militarized society. Fortifications are ambiguous at best. There are no clear palaces, no obvious royal tombs stuffed with captured wealth, no iconography of conquest or dominion that defines nearly every other complex society of the same period. One of the largest, most organized, most geographically extensive civilizations of the ancient world appears to have functioned for centuries without the machinery of war at its center. That is the puzzle. And the cities themselves are where we start solving it. The cities didn't announce themselves. That's the first thing to understand. There were no pyramids rising above the horizon, no stone columns poking out of the earth, no legends pointing curious travellers toward buried treasures. When the first hints of the Harappan world began surfacing in the 19th century, nobody recognized what they were looking at. Locals had been pulling ancient fired bricks out of the ground for generations, using them as ballast for railway construction because they were uniform, durable, and conveniently abundant. Somewhere beneath the fields and villages of what is now Pakistan and northwestern India, one of the largest civilizations the ancient world had ever produced was silently waiting. And people were building railroad beds with pieces of it. The formal story of rediscovery begins in the 1850s, when a British engineer named Alexander Cunningham, who would later found the Archaeological Survey of India, took note of some unusual artefacts being turned up near a site called Harappa in the Punjab. He documented a strange seal, a small carved object with an animal figure and a script nobody could read, and filed it away as an anomaly. It didn't fit anything he knew, so it sat. Decades passed. More bricks went into more railways. It wasn't until the 1920s that the picture began to sharpen, and even then it happened almost accidentally. John Marshall, the Director General of the Archaeological Survey of India, authorized excavations at two sites that had been generating scattered reports of unusual finds. One was Harappa, in what is now Pakistani Punjab. The other was a site far to the south, in the Sindh region called Mohenjo-daro, a name that translates roughly as Mound of the Dead. What his teams found at both locations upended everything archaeologists thought they understood about the ancient subcontinent. Here were cities, real cities, planned, layered, sophisticated, and apparently old enough to be contemporary with the great urban centres of Mesopotamia and Egypt. The announcement in 1924 was quietly explosive in academic circles. Marshall published his preliminary findings and essentially told the world that South Asia had produced an independent urban civilization, one that nobody had suspected existed, one with its own architecture and its own script and its own material culture that bore no obvious debt to anything else known at the time. The reaction ranged from fascination to skepticism to the particular kind of institutional reluctance that greets discoveries that require rewriting textbooks. But why had it taken so long? Why were cities of this scale hidden so effectively? The answer involves geography, hydrology, and the particular cruelty of how time treats mud brick. Unlike the stone monuments of Egypt or the fired stone temples of the Aegean, the great structures of the Harappan world were built primarily from kiln-fired brick, which is durable enough to survive millennia underground, but which, once exposed to the surface, begins to look unremarkable fairly quickly. More importantly, the rivers that had been the lifeblood of this civilization had been moving. The Indus and its tributaries shift their courses over centuries, a process called channel migration, and those shifts had buried sites under meters of alluvial silt, cut them off from their original geographic context, and in some cases physically erased them. The Gagga-Hakra system, which once supported what may have been the densest concentration of Harappan settlements, had declined so dramatically that the landscape along its former course looked like nothing but scrubland and dry riverbeds. Modern development has compounded the problem. Settlements have been built directly on top of ancient ones, sometimes for thousands of years continuously, which is both archaeologically frustrating and completely understandable. People live where the land is good, and the land was good in these places for exactly the same reasons it was good 5,000 years ago. Harappa itself sits beneath a modern village. Mohenjo-Daro, located in a more isolated position, has been better preserved. But even there, rising groundwater and salinity from irrigation agriculture have been eating the ruins from below faster than excavators can document them from above. What excavation has revealed, at both major sites and at the dozens of smaller urban centres since identified, is something that meets every archaeological threshold for calling a place a city. Density matters, and these settlements were dense, with populations estimated at Mohenjo-Daro alone potentially reaching 30 to 50,000 people at its peak, though those figures come with significant uncertainty. Planning is evident in ways that go beyond accident or incremental growth. Streets follow grid patterns oriented to compass points. Neighbourhoods cluster around central areas with large public structures. Craft production zones are identifiable as distinct areas where the debris of specific industries, bead-making, shell-working, metalworking, pottery production, concentrates in ways that suggest organised specialisation rather than household improvisation. Large storage structures, often called granaries though the function remains debated, appear at multiple sites, suggesting coordinated management of surplus at a scale that implies institutional organisation of some kind. What you do not find, or find only ambiguously, are palaces, temples in any recognisable form, royal tombs, or the kind of monumental religious architecture that marks nearly every other ancient urban tradition. The cities were built for something. The question of what exactly is where things get complicated, and the complication is made permanent by the script. Thousands of inscriptions have been found, mostly on those small carved seals that first caught Cunningham's attention in the 1850s. They use somewhere between 400 and 600 distinct signs, a number that suggests a system somewhere between a syllabary and a logographic script, complex enough to encode real language, simple enough to be learned and applied consistently across the entire civilization. No bilingual inscription has ever been found. No Rosetta Stone exists for the Harappan world. Every interpretation remains contested, every translation claim should be treated with firm skepticism, which means that the people who built these cities have not yet spoken to us directly. We can see what they made, we cannot hear what they said. And that silence sits at the centre of everything. If you zoom out from the broken walls and isolated rooms and try to see an Indus city as a whole, one thing hits you almost immediately. Someone loved straight lines. At Mohenjo-Daro, Harappa, Dholavira, Kalibangan, Rakhigarhi, Lothal, site after site, the same basic pattern appears. Streets run north-south and east-west, intersecting at right angles with a regularity that looks almost modern. The main avenues are strikingly consistent in width, often around 9 or 10 metres, with smaller side streets and lanes scaled down in predictable ratios. City blocks fall into tidy rectangles. Houses front onto the streets with shared walls like townhouses. Turn a corner and the geometry keeps going. This is not what human settlements naturally do if you just let them grow. Most ancient towns start as clusters. Houses go up around a water source or crossroads. Paths wear into the ground along routes people actually walk, and over generations those footpaths become lanes, then roads, then awkward, winding streets with odd angles and dead ends. You can read the history of those choices in the layout. It's messy, organic, charming if you like that sort of thing, but you can see that nobody ever had the power or the inclination to step back and say, all right, let's redraw everything from scratch. The Indus world feels like somebody did. But here's the strange part. We don't see the somebody. There are no obvious royal districts, no walled-off palace complex that screams central command, no monumental inscription of a king boasting that he laid out the streets or rebuilt the city according to divine plan, and yet, block after block, city after city, the same grid logic repeats. You can walk down a street at Harappa, then fly hundreds of kilometres in your imagination to Mohenjo-Daro, and the bones of the plan are immediately familiar. This is what archaeologists mean when they talk about urban planning in the Indus context. It's not just that there are straight streets, it's that the straightness is standardised. The bricks make this even clearer. Across a territory stretching roughly 1,000 kilometres from north to south, builders used kiln-fired bricks that almost always follow the same proportional rule, length to width to height in a 4:2:1 ratio. The actual sizes vary a little, sometimes larger, sometimes smaller, but the proportions hold with an almost obsessive consistency during the mature Harappan period. That might sound like a trivial detail, but start thinking like a builder. If every brick has the same proportions, every wall behaves predictably. Courses line up in regular patterns, corners meet cleanly, openings for doors, windows and drains can be repeated with minimal adjustment. You can train brickmakers once on how to mould and fire the standard form, and their products will fit anywhere in the city. You can move teams of workers between building projects without worrying that the bricks from one kiln won't match those from another. This is standardization as an invisible infrastructure. It saves thought, labour, and time. It also implies something about how these societies were organized. To hold a brick ratio that's consistent over such a wide area, and for centuries, you need more than personal preference. You need norms, rules, explicit or implicit, that brickmakers and builders feel obligated to follow. Maybe guild traditions, maybe written specifications, maybe teaching lineages where apprentices copy their masters, who copied their masters, all using the same measuring cords and moulds. Some researchers see this brick uniformity as evidence for a strong central authority, a state that imposed standards across its territory, the way modern governments impose currency systems or road sign fonts. That's one possible reading. But the absence of royal monuments suggests another possibility: coordination without a visible monarch. Shared standards enforced not by a single emperor's blueprint, but by a civilization-wide agreement on how a proper building should be made. If you walked into an Indus brickyard 5,000 years ago, you probably didn't need a king's edict on the wall to know what size to produce. The size was the culture. The same pattern appears in the overall layout of the cities. There isn't one single master plan that fits every site, that's important. But the recurring themes are hard to miss. Many large settlements show a division between a raised, fortified mound and a lower, more extensive area around it. Archaeologists used to call these the citadel and the lower city, borrowing language from Mesopotamia and medieval Europe, but those labels probably smuggle in more hierarchy than the evidence strictly supports. What we can say is that these elevated platforms typically host large public buildings, big halls, baths, massive storage structures, sometimes carefully arranged open spaces. Below, spreading out from the elevated core, are the residential neighbourhoods, dense grids of houses, lanes, wells and drainage channels. In several cities, specific quarters clearly specialised in particular crafts. At Harappa, one sector is dominated by evidence for bead-making, waste from drilling tiny holes in semi-precious stones, failed beads, specialised tools. In another, you get concentrations of metalworking debris, or shellworking remains, or pottery kilns. This is zoning 5,000 years ago. Not zoning in the modern legal sense with printed regulations and planning commissions, but in the sense that different activities cluster in different parts of the city according to widely understood patterns. Live here, fire pots over there, store grain or other surpluses up on that raised platform. Put your workshops downwind. Keep the main north-south avenue clear enough for traffic. Put wells at regular intervals. Run drains along the sides of the streets. Other ancient cities had some of this, but rarely at this scale of uniformity. In Mesopotamia, for example, cities like Ur or Uruk show planning episodes. There are straight streets and monumental axes, especially around temples and palaces, but outside those formal cores the cityscape tangles into irregular lanes and courtyards that grew by accretion. In Egypt, workers' towns like Deir el-Medina or the settlements around pyramid complexes are rigidly planned, but those are single-purpose state-created enclaves, company towns to serve royal projects. The Indus pattern is different. The grid is not just for a temple precinct or a royal residence, it's the default. The straight-line logic governs ordinary houses, back alleys and drainage systems. It repeats in big cities and smaller ones. You can stand in a modest lane in a secondary settlement and still feel that you're inside the same planning tradition as Mohenjo-Daro or Harappa. That consistency becomes more intriguing when you remember what's missing. Large-scale, royal propaganda, carved reliefs of kings trampling enemies, inscriptions spelling out building programs. In Mesopotamia, rulers carve their names into bricks and list the projects they claim credit for. In Egypt, pharaohs literally cover their monuments with texts about why they built them. In the Indus world, the bricks are mute. The public buildings are anonymous. The seals show animals and short inscriptions, but no obvious portraits of rulers. So where did the plan come from? One answer is that it emerged from below, from a shared urban culture that valued order, cleanliness, predictability, and perhaps a particular cosmological orientation. If everybody believes that a proper city aligns to the cardinal directions, that Main Street should be so wide, that drains should run here and not there, then any group of competent builders can reproduce the pattern without a dictatorial mastermind. Think about traditional house forms in many cultures. You don't need a central ministry to get similar houses generation after generation. You just need carpenters and masons who were raised inside the same tradition. Now extend that to an entire urban system, supported by standardized bricks, by widely shared craft practices, by a script that might have encoded contracts or measurements we can't read, and by social expectations that this is how we build. Planning, in this sense, is less about one blueprint and more about a collective memory of how a city ought to look. That doesn't mean there was no authority. Someone decided where to put that raised platform, where to run the main avenues, how to distribute public wells and bathing areas. Someone coordinated the labour to level ground, haul bricks, lay out drains and keep everything reasonably aligned with the compass. But the remarkable thing about the Indus case is that the authority remains faceless. The plan is visible, the planner is not, and the more sites archaeologists uncover, the more this quiet uniformity stands out. Even smaller towns along old river channels and trade routes show the same right angles, the same brick ratios, the the same preference for rational layouts over picturesque chaos. It's as if the civilization had collectively agreed on a template, and then every community from major city to regional hub plugged into it. Those straight lines, those standardized bricks, those carefully differentiated zones of living, working and storing, they're not just aesthetic choices, they're the physical expression of a society that prioritized coordination over display, function over spectacle, and nowhere does that priority show more clearly than in the way they manage the thing that destroys most ancient cities from within: water. Start at the level of a single house. You walk through a doorway off one of those straight streets, and almost immediately somewhere in the interior you hit water. In city after city, archaeologists keep finding the same basic elements. A brick-lined well either inside the house or just in the courtyard, a small bathing platform made of neatly laid bricks, or a plastered surface that could be kept clean, and some kind of drain leading away from that wet area. This is not an occasional luxury. At Mohenjo-Daro, there are neighborhoods where it feels like every second or third house has its own well. Harappa, Dholavira, smaller sites too. The pattern repeats. In many ancient cities, water is centralized. A big public well, a temple cistern, a canal where everyone queues up. In the Indus world, water infrastructure seeps right into domestic space. That has consequences. If there's a well in your courtyard, you don't need to haul water across town every time you want to drink, cook or wash. You can bathe daily if you choose, wash clothes, rinse pots, clean floors without planning a trip. Water shifts from being a scarce, time-consuming errand to something designed into the architecture of ordinary life, and the houses are built around that idea. The bathing platforms are often tucked into corners where splashing won't soak the rest of the room. Low walls or screens sometimes separate washing areas from other parts of the house, suggesting some sense of privacy or modesty. The floors around these spaces are often carefully sealed with plaster, so water doesn't seep down and undermine the foundation. Then there's what happens after the water hits the ground. In a lot of ancient settlements, wastewater just goes wherever. Out the door, into the street, into handy depressions where it stagnates, breeds insects, and turns into a problem for someone else. Indus cities look like they took the opposite approach. Water in, water out, on purpose. From those household bathing areas, channels run toward the street. Sometimes they're shallow, brick-lined gutters on the surface. Very often they connect to covered drains running below the lanes. These aren't vague ditches. They're engineered conduits, often with standardized brick sides and covers, laid out with a clear sense of slope so water actually moves. Follow one of those street drains and you see another layer of thought. At intervals there are small chambers or openings, what modern engineers would immediately recognize as inspection points. A brick or stone slab could be lifted, sediment scooped out, blockages cleared. In some neighborhoods, drains from several houses feed into a slightly larger street drain, which then feeds into an even larger one along a main avenue, stepping up in size as they gather more flow. It is a hierarchy, not of palaces and slums, but of pipes. Near the ends of these systems, especially at the edges of settlements, archaeologists have found what are usually called soak pits, deep stone or brick-lined pits filled with gravel or porous material. Wastewater flows into them, seeps down, and disperses rather than flooding the surface. In some cases, heavier solids are trapped in settling tanks before the water reaches the soak pit. Essentially a primitive version of what modern sanitation engineers try to do. Covered drains, soak pits, maintenance access. This combination is not trivial. It implies people were thinking about multiple timescales at once. You don't add access points unless you expect to be cleaning these drains for years. You don't line soak pits unless you worry about erosion and collapse. You don't coordinate slope across several city blocks unless somebody's checking levels with string, water, or some other measuring trick. And crucially, you don't get this kind of integrated system house by house, family by family, acting in total isolation. It doesn't require a king issuing decrees, but it does require agreement. Someone has to say, our lane's drain will run this way, at this depth, tying into the main line there. Neighbours have to consent to connect, or at least not to block. Brickmakers have to produce the right sizes to make it all fit. Whoever digs the well has to avoid puncturing the waste channels, which means some record, mental or otherwise, of where those channels lies. This is civic organisation, expressed in clay and brick instead of statutes and edicts. You can see it even more clearly when you step back to look at the public side of water. On the raised mounds of major cities, a handful of large structures seem to focus on collective water use. The most famous is at Mohenjo-Daro, a big rectangular tank, brick-lined and bitumen-sealed, set within a complex of rooms and platforms. It's tempting to call it the Great Bath, and imagine sacred rituals, communal cleansing, maybe religious festivals. Many archaeologists do exactly that. Others caution that we don't really know. Maybe it had administrative or even recreational functions we wouldn't immediately guess. But whatever that specific building was for, it clearly demanded communal effort. Digging a massive tank, importing waterproofing materials, building and maintaining the stairways and surrounding rooms. This isn't a single household's DIY project. It's a civic enterprise. Elsewhere in the cities, smaller public wells dot major intersections and courtyards. Some larger structures, possibly assembly halls or storage facilities, appear to be linked with nearby wells and drainage features. At Dolavira, elaborate systems of reservoirs and channels capture and store rainfall and seasonal runoff within and around the city's walls. Again, the exact social meanings are debated, ritual, practical, or both. But the technical aspect is consistent, capturing, moving, storing, and disposing of water at scale. It's easy to get dazzled by the engineering and forget what it's doing to human bodies. A city that manages its wastewater, that keeps standing filth out of streets and courtyards, that separates drinking water from contaminated runoff, is a city that changes the disease landscape. We should be careful here. This was not modern germ theory, and parasites and pathogens still had plenty of room to operate. But even without microscopes, people can learn very quickly that foul-smelling standing water is bad news, that clean wells are precious, that certain layouts smell better and make you sick less often. If infant mortality drops even a little because of better drainage, if fewer adults are laid low by chronic gut infections, suddenly more labour is available. Children survive to become workers and parents. Skilled craft specialists spend more days at the kiln or the bead drill, and fewer days recovering from whatever was in last month's floodwater. That is how something as mundane as a covered drain ends up tied to urban stability. Consider maintenance. These drains don't clean themselves. Somebody has to lift those slabs, haul out the sludge, repair collapsed segments, monitor wells that begin to taste off. That implies workers assigned to the task, either as a formal role, something like a sanitation crew, or as a rotating duty among households, neighbourhoods, or occupational groups. It also implies information flow. When a drain backs up halfway down a street, people have to agree on who is responsible, whose section is blocked, whether the whole line needs regrading. Complaints, negotiations, perhaps even basic regulations follow. None of this shows up in inscriptions we can read, but the physical system almost demands some mechanism of coordination. Zoom out one more level, and a pattern emerges. Other ancient civilizations poured enormous resources into monuments, pyramids, ziggurats, colossal statues shouting royal names at the sky. The Indus cities, as far as we can tell, invested that kind of sustained society-wide effort into infrastructure that disappears under your feet. The things most heavily engineered are not towering kings, but the stuff of daily survival. Bricks, streets, wells, drains, storage. It's not that they lacked the capacity for spectacle. Raising a whole quarter of a city on an artificial platform, carving huge reservoirs out of hard ground, standardizing bricks across 1,000 kilometers, these are monumental feats in their own right. They just point in a different direction. They suggest a set of priorities where the critical problems are not, how do we immortalize the ruler, but how do we keep tens of thousands of people living close together without poisoning themselves? And how do we make the daily chores of washing, cooking, and cleaning as frictionless as possible? Even the anonymity of the system fits that pattern. No king's name stamped on the drain covers, no victory inscription on the side of a reservoir. The water flows, the waste disappears, the city keeps going. The infrastructure does its job so well that it becomes invisible until it breaks, or until, thousands of years later, we peel back the bricks and realize what was quietly holding everything together. When you add it all up, the household wells, the bathing platforms, the covered street drains with their inspection points, the soak pits at the fringes, the big collective tanks and reservoirs, you see a civilization that treated engineering not as a way to glorify individuals, but as a way to structure everyday life. The straight streets make that order visible on the surface. The water and drains make it livable underneath. And once you start reading the cities this way, you can turn from pipes and wells to the spaces built around them, the houses, the shared courtyards, the quiet signals that tell you who these people thought they were and how they chose to live together. Step back from the drains and look at what they're serving. In many ancient cities, houses turn their best faces to the street, porches, columned facades, doorways made to impress passers-by. Indus houses do almost the opposite. Streets give you walls and doorways. The real life of the house is turned inward. The typical home is wrapped around a courtyard. Not every house is a perfect rectangle, and not every site preserves the same details, but over and over a pattern shows up. A front doorway leading into a small entry space, sometimes with a turn that blocks direct line of sight, then a central open court and rooms arranged around it. The well, if it's inside the property, often sits in that courtyard. The bathing platform usually nestles in a corner or side room off the court, with a drain leading out. This is a world built for interiority. Courtyards bring light and air deep into the house without exposing the occupants to the street. They give you a place to dry grain, cook, work, talk, and sleep on hot nights, while high walls protect you from dust and eyes. Children can run, animals can be tethered, and daily life can unfold in a space that is both outside and inside at the same time. Privacy is not an accident in these layouts. Many houses are designed so that from the main entrance you can't see straight into the central court. You enter, turn, maybe pass through a small antechamber or side passage, and only then does the main space open up. Some homes have multiple doors leading to different streets or lanes, hinting at more than one way to manage visitors, one path for guests, another for family or service access. Within the house, too, there are gradients. Not all rooms are alike. Some are larger, more central, probably used for shared activities, eating or work. Others are smaller and more tucked away, reachable only after you pass through other rooms or up a stair. Many houses show evidence of upper stories, staircases built into thick walls, collapsed rubble suggesting rooms once existed above. Whatever happened up there, storage, sleeping quarters, more private family spaces, it added another layer to how people controlled access and visibility. You can read values off this floor plan. A culture that builds around courtyards, that interrupts sight lines, that separates wet and dry areas, that tucks bathing into half-hidden corners, is one that cares about modesty, about separating public and private, about giving people the ability to choose who sees which parts of their life. This is not a collection of huts tossed together for convenience. It's social thought poured into brick. But if many houses share the same basic grammar, they don't all speak with the same volume. Some homes in Mohenjo-Daro and Harappa are noticeably bigger than others. They span multiple street frontages, have 2 or even 3 courtyards, and include long ranges of rooms. You might see multiple wells on a single property, or a private stair that seems to link different wings of the building. In contrast, other units are compact. One modest courtyard with just a few rooms, maybe a shared wall with a neighbour, sometimes no internal well at all, relying instead on a public one outside. The variation is real, and it's one of the few clear material hints we get about social difference. Larger houses often show more built-in amenities. They might have better finished brickwork, more extensive drainage, extra storage spaces that could have held goods, tools, or surplus grain. Some contain small rooms thought to be workshops or offices, places where someone might have weighed goods, kept records, or managed household labour. Smaller houses aren't necessarily poor in an absolute sense. Having a brick house with even one room and access to clean water is already a big step up from many Neolithic villages. But in relative terms, someone is living more comfortably than someone else. And yet the differences are not nearly as extreme as you might expect for cities that reached sizes comparable to early Mesopotamian centres. There are no sprawling stone palaces dominating hilltops, no isolated compounds walled off and massively fortified within the city proper. The biggest known buildings, like the so-called pillared halls or large warehouse-like structures, feel more communal or functional than obviously residential. If an all-powerful dynast lived in one of these cities, they did not leave behind the kind of architectural footprint that kings elsewhere seemed unable to resist. The same muted pattern shows up in death. In Egypt and Mesopotamia, once elite burials appear, they are impossible to miss. Tombs full of gold, carved stone sarcophagi, grave, good, screaming hierarchy. So far, the Indus world gives us almost nothing like that at its urban heart. Cemeteries have been found, and some differences exist. Certain graves have more pottery or personal ornaments, but nothing that looks like a pharaoh's tomb or a royal necropolis. No gigantic barrows, no obvious mausoleums carefully aligned with temples and palaces. The physical record of lavish, 1% funerals is stunningly thin. This combination, some variation in house size and amenities, but little in terms of ostentatious palaces or royal tombs, is one of the main reasons people talk about the Indus cities as unusually egalitarian. But we should be careful with that word. Egalitarian doesn't mean everyone had the same life, the same power, or the same voice. It might mean that status differences were expressed differently, through more subtle cues we don't yet fully understand. Fine cloth doesn't preserve well. A merchant's ledger scratched on perishable material might vanish. Influence can live in whose opinion matters at a meeting, not in who owns the tallest tower. What we can see is that if there was a tiny hereditary ruling class flaunting its wealth in stone and gold, it left far less evidence than its contemporaries. So how did these cities run? One idea is governance by councils, clan elders, neighbourhood representatives, or heads of powerful families meeting in some of those big halls to decide on shared issues, maintenance of drains, allocation of water, responses to floods or shortages. The uniformity of bricks and street grids from city to city suggests standardised norms, even something close to regulations, but they don't have to originate from a single monarch. They could arise from negotiated agreements between groups that shared language, religion, and trade interests. Another route points to merchants. The Indus world moved goods on an impressive scale. Beads, metals, shell, stone, perhaps textiles, all flowing between cities and out to Mesopotamia and beyond. Merchant families or guild-like organisations may have held significant power, not by sitting on thrones, but by controlling credit, storage, and distribution. In such a system, a big house might not be a palace for a divine king, but the town base of a trading dynasty or consortium. Civic administrators are the third piece of the puzzle. You don't lay out a perfectly regular street grid, zone neighbourhoods, and coordinate drains and wells without people whose job is essentially city planning. These planners and supervisors might have been appointed by councils, hired by merchants, or embedded in some sort of temple or civic institution we can't easily identify. They may have operated as a professional class, surveyors, scribes, overseers and record keepers whose authority was practical rather than charismatic. All of these models, councils, merchant influence, civic administration, can coexist. Picture a city where influential merchant households fund building projects, councils representing different quarters or lineages approve them, and a cadre of specialists handles the technical side. That kind of shared power leaves a different archaeological signature than top-down royal command. It looks like consistent standards without single-point monuments. It looks like careful order without an obvious face. But again, absence is not proof. The fact that we haven't found a king's palace or a royal tomb doesn't prove they never existed. Parts of cities remain unexcavated. Floods and later occupation can erase fragile structures. Elite complexes built mostly of mud brick can vanish almost completely after 4,000 years. It's also possible that hierarchy expressed itself through perishable things. Textiles dyed with expensive colours, wooden furniture inlaid with metal and shell, food luxury, servants and slaves whose lives don't leave clear marks in the ground. The archaeological record is biased toward brick, stone and bone. A society can be sharply stratified and still hide much of that stratification from us, simply because it invested its status symbols in things that rot. What we can say with some confidence is that these cities radiate a particular message. They're not shouting about conquering kings or warrior elites. They're whispering about neighbourhoods, courtyards, and shared standards. About people who coordinated enough to align house walls along common grids, to agree on door thresholds and street widths, to mesh private wells with public drains. The social signals here are not banners and statues. They're the quieter messages embedded in how space is carved up. A house that turns inward, that layers thresholds and courtyards says, family life matters, privacy matters, continuity matters. A street lined with similar doorways, serviced by the same drains, suggests neighbours whose daily rhythms are intertwined. A city where the biggest built statements are reservoirs and platforms instead of pyramids hints at priorities tilted toward collective function. Whether or not everyone truly shared in that system equally is a question we may never fully resolve. But we can see the framework they built to live within. And within that framework, some people became more specialised than others. If you walk those streets not as a planner but as a customer, another pattern starts to stand out. The shops, the workshops, the clusters of tools and waste that show where craftspeople lived and worked, turning clay, stone and metal into the goods that tied this whole quiet, complex society together. Follow that customer's path a little farther and the city starts to sound different. The hum of conversation at a well gives way to the sharper clink of stone on stone, the scratch of tools on shell, the low beat of someone tamping clay. You've stepped into the work belts of the city, the workshops. They aren't factories in our sense. There's no smokestack district or fenced industrial park. Instead, clusters of activity bloom along certain streets and courtyards, repeated across multiple cities with almost eerie consistency. Archaeologists recognise them not by signs over doorways, but by the quiet wreckage of repeated work. Start with one of the Indus civilization's most iconic products, beads. In places like Chanhudaro and Lothal, entire blocks seem devoted to turning raw stone into tiny cylinders and spheres that would end up on necks and wrists across an enormous region. The ground is littered with debitage, the flakes and chips that fall away when you drill and shape carnelian or agate. Drill bits of a distinctive standardized style show up in piles, some worn to nubs from hours of use. You see half-finished beads, misdrilled pieces, fragments that snapped just before they were done. This is how archaeologists know they're looking at production, not just use. A few beads in a house might be personal ornaments. Hundreds of rejects coupled with tool sets and firing installations tell a different story. Dedicated craft areas, people spending most of their waking hours turning raw stone into commodities. The same pattern appears in shell working. Far from the sea, in inland cities, you find drifts of shell offcuts and blanks. The shells themselves often come from specific marine species, traced back to the Arabian Sea. In the workshops, they've been cut into bangles, inlays and decorative objects. You can follow the process in the ground. Whole shells, then rough disc-like pieces, then more refined rings and carved shapes, then the broken or rejected ones that never made it onto a wrist. Ivory tells a similar story, though in smaller volumes. Slender strips, carved pieces and tiny offcuts show that tusks were being shaped into combs, pins, and perhaps inlays for furniture or boxes. Again, the distribution matters. Certain houses harbour concentrations of ivory waste and specialised tools, suggesting that those addresses belong to people whose family identity might have been the ivory workers, generation after generation. Then there's clay. Almost every settlement in the world with pottery leaves behind broken sherds. But the Indus cities show more than just domestic use. Some areas yield thick layers of misfired pots, wasters with warped rims or collapsed bodies stacked near kilns whose walls still bear the orange-black scars of repeated firing. These aren't casual hearths. They are purpose-built structures with controlled airflows, sometimes set just outside dense residential zones, as if people agreed that roasting clay at high temperatures was better done at a bit of a distance. The shapes themselves are telling. Certain forms, particular jar profiles, specific bowl sizes, recur with remarkable uniformity across vast distances. That points not just to local potters copying each other, but to some wider sense of what a proper storage jar or serving bowl looks like. You can imagine a potter's apprentice learning to measure clay coils by hand to match their teacher's silhouette exactly, because customers in the marketplace expect vessels that fit into existing racks, lids, or habits. Metal adds another layer of specialization. We don't find giant blast furnaces or sprawling foundries, but we do find small-scale smelting and working zones, crucibles, slag, droplets of copper and bronze, moulds for casting tools and ornaments. In some neighborhoods, you get repeated associations of weights, moulds, and metal debris. These locations look like the nerve centers for turning imported ingots and ore into finished blades, chisels, fish hooks, mirrors, and ornaments. The evidence suggests a division of labor even within metalworking. Some zones focus on bigger utilitarian forms, others seem more associated with fine castings, perhaps jewelry or status objects. The tools of the trade, stone hammers, anvils, polishing stones, cluster there, marking spaces where sound and heat and risk were part of the daily routine. Textiles are trickier. Cloth almost never survives 4,000 years in the soil, but the ghosts of the industry remain. Spindle whirls, loom weights, and impressions of woven fabric preserved in clay hint at a city literally wrapped in threads. At multiple sites, concentrations of whirls and certain types of weights appear together, suggesting rooms where spinning and weaving were primary activities. Fibre sources seem to have included cotton. The Indus region may be one of the earliest places where cotton was systematically cultivated, as well as flax and other plants. Imagine the soundscape there. The soft whir of spindles, the rhythmic creak of looms, conversations flowing over the steady movement of hands. Textile work is one of those crafts that can absorb entire households. Older women teaching younger ones, children starting with simple tasks, men perhaps involved in certain stages like finishing or dyeing. None of that shows up directly in the archaeology, but the density of tools and the importance of cloth in any pre-modern economy suggest that entire kin groups could have built their lives around managing and producing textiles. This is where the human angle comes into focus. Archaeologists can map production zones on plans, but behind every scatter of bead rejects is a body bent over a drill, eyes straining to center a hole on a stone smaller than a fingernail. Behind every heap of shell dust are hands scratched and raw, from working a material that's both beautiful and abrasive. Behind each row of pots set near a kiln is someone who spent days preparing clay, shaping forms, checking temperatures by feel and experience, because a misjudged firing means losing an entire batch. Apprenticeship isn't preserved as a fossil, but its traces are everywhere. You see objects that look like practice pieces, oddly proportioned beads, off-standard pots, shell bangles that are just a bit too thick or thin. These may be the work of learners, their mistakes swept into the same dumps as the master's rare failures. Skill doesn't appear overnight. It's hammered and ground and fired into people over years. Some houses blur the line between home and workplace. A courtyard with a well and bathing platform might also host a row of grinding stones used not for grain, but for polishing beads. A small back room might contain the majority of the shell waste, suggesting that the household kept its messiest tasks slightly out of sight. An office space off the street might have a raised platform, a couple of standardized weights, and a convenient ledge where scales could hang. Perhaps this is where a metal worker or merchant took payments, weighed out raw material, negotiated orders. Standard weights are one of the most intriguing parts of this puzzle. Across many Indus sites, small stone weights appear in regular geometric shapes. often cubical or barrel-shaped, following a consistent progression of sizes. When measured, these weights fall into a repeating series, a kind of shared metrology. The same basic system turns up in cities separated by hundreds of kilometers. This matters. You don't need standardized weights if everyone is bartering one chicken for 2 pots in small face-to-face exchanges. You need them when people are trading quantities of grain, bundles of cloth, or ingots of metal, often with partners who are not close kin and may not see each other again for months. A beadmaker selling strings to a merchant wants to be paid fairly for the material and labour. The merchant wants to know that a weight called X in one city is the same X in another. The presence of these weights right inside workshop houses suggests that craftspeople weren't just producers. They were active participants in regulated exchange systems. They weighed their raw inputs, measured out their outputs, and operated within norms that stretched across the whole civilization. Those norms tied directly into trade networks and urban demand. Beadmakers don't just wake up one day and decide to mass produce without a market. Shell workshops far from the coast only exist if someone is bringing in shells regularly, and someone else is eager to wear or resell the finished bangles. Textile tool clusters make sense in cities whose residents, from small house to big, want and expect cloth of certain qualities. Urban density magnifies this effect. When tens of thousands of people live within a few square kilometres, everyday needs multiply. Pots for storing and cooking, tools for building and farming, ornaments to signal identity, status and taste, ritual objects for household shrines or community events. A city is a machine that runs on specialised labour, and the Indus cities are no exception. What's striking is how integrated that specialisation seems to be. Workshops sit inside the living fabric of the city, not cordoned off as polluting zones. Production scales are large enough to suggest export, but many crafts are still embedded in domestic courtyards, not in detached state-run complexes. Standard weights show regulation, but they sit in the hands of everyday producers and traders, not only in some distant temple treasury. Put the pieces together, and a picture emerges of makers who are neither anonymous cogs nor exalted geniuses. They are families and lineages whose names we don't know, but whose skills kept the whole system going. The bead cutter whose work ends up in a necklace buried in Mesopotamia, the potter whose jars line a warehouse by the dock at Lothal, the weaver whose cloth never fossilizes but whose spindle whorl still sits where it fell when the house collapsed. Their world is one of repetition and rhythm, shaping, drilling, firing, weighing, tied by invisible threads to caravans crossing deserts and boats hugging coastlines. To understand the power of Indus trade, you have to start here, in these noisy, dusty, disciplined spaces, where value is literally made by hand. Step out of the workshop district and follow those hands' creations along their next journey. From these courtyards and kilns, goods flow outward, through city gates, along riverbanks, across salt flats and sea channels, into a trade web so wide that Indus seals and beads show up in lands whose languages we barely know. Follow one of those bead strings, one pot, one bundle of cloth as it leaves the workshop. It doesn't just vanish into some vague market. It enters a system of movement that is every bit as engineered as drains and streets, but spread across hundreds, sometimes thousands, of kilometres. Start with the rivers. The Indus itself is a continental conveyor belt. Seasonal pulses of water swell it. Floodplains spread out, then retreat, leaving behind rich silt and navigable channels. We don't have surviving boats from this period, but we don't really need them to know they existed. Lightweight craft, dugout canoes, reed boats, planked vessels stitched together are almost inevitable when you live beside a broad, slow-moving river lined with cities. In the archaeological record, the clues are indirect but consistent. You see city after city oriented toward water, wharf-like structures, broad brick platforms at the river's edge, align with what would have been ancient channels. In some places, rows of large storage jars and brick-lined pits cluster near these edges, as if goods were being accumulated in one spot ready to be loaded or unloaded. Imagine standing at the waterfront of a city like Mohenjo-Daro when the river is in full flow. Boats bob against moorings. Labourers carry basket after basket from the decks to warehouses, or from warehouse doors down to waiting hulls. Standardised weights come out again here, not inside a courtyard workshop, but in the hands of porters, scribes and merchants, making sure what was promised is what is actually being shipped. The river doesn't end the story, it begins it. Because from the river, goods radiate inland. Follow the Indus upstream, and you reach zones rich in stone for tools, for beads, for monumental building. Turn along its tributaries, and you touch farming communities, pastoralists, small towns that feed and supply the cities. From those smaller places, footpaths and cart tracks push out into the drier fringes, into what are now deserts and scrub, but in the 3rd millennium BCE could support seasonal movement, grazing and trade. Archaeologists recover this inland web in fragments, a cluster of pottery sherds in a seemingly empty landscape that matched the standardized forms of big cities. A small site with a few rooms, a well, and a surprising number of seals or weights, acting like a relay station. Copper from distant ore sources turning up in places with no local metal. Stones used for beads or tools that can be geologically traced back to quarries hundreds of kilometres away. Taken alone, any one of these might be a curiosity. Together they map corridors. Picture caravans crossing semi-arid plains, not as romantic lone camels on the horizon, but as practical logistics. Ox carts piled with jars, donkeys loaded with sacks of grain or cotton thread, guards and guides who know where seasonal waterholes are and which tracks stay passable after the last rains. To the west, across what are now the deserts of Pakistan and eastern Iran, this inland network links up with somebody else's world. Because while Indus craftspeople are drilling beads and casting bronze, city builders are rising in Mesopotamia. Sumerian and later Akkadian polities whose own texts talk about a distant trading land called Meluha. The exact identification is debated, but many scholars think Meluha is the Indus region. The archaeological evidence nudges heavily in that direction. Indus-style seals, distinctive square or rectangular objects carved with a short line of Indus signs above an animal figure, have turned up in Mesopotamian cities like Ur, Lagash and Susa. They sit in layers dated to the same broad period as the mature Indus cities. Some bear motifs unmistakably Indus in style: humped bulls, unicorn-like creatures, the familiar grid of carefully carved script signs. Then there are the goods themselves. In Mesopotamian sites you find carnelian beads cut and drilled in the same style as those mass-produced in Indus workshops. You see shell objects whose raw material must have come from the Arabian Sea, yet whose final form follows Indus conventions. Cylinder seals and art from the Persian Gulf sometimes depict boats with particular profiles, cargoes, and crew that suggest knowledge of or direct contact with people from the East. The trade isn't one way. In Indus cities you find materials that don't belong to local geology, certain kinds of copper and tin that likely travelled from highland Iran, or even further afield. Lapis lazuli, the deep blue stone beloved in Mesopotamian and later Egyptian art, appears in Indus contexts, and its most famous sources lie in what is now Afghanistan. Silver, rare but present, probably followed similar lines. There are also motifs that seem to travel. Designs on seals, patterns on pottery, emblematic animals. They don't match perfectly, but you can see family resemblances, echoes. A Mesopotamian cylinder seal shows a figure handling an animal similar to the Indus unicorn. A motif of a boat with high prow and stern appears both on Gulf seals and in Indus-adjacent material. It's not that one side is copying the other line for line. It's more that long-distance contact allows ideas to diffuse, to be reinterpreted and folded into local styles. The hinge between these two worlds is the sea. Here the evidence grows particularly vivid. Along the coasts of what are now Pakistan and western India, a string of Indus-linked settlements appear. Places like Lothal, Dholavira's coastal contemporaries, and sites along the Makran coast. Some are small, but their layouts and finds scream port. At Lothal, archaeologists uncovered a massive brick-lined basin connected in antiquity to a channel leading out toward the Gulf of Kumbat. Interpretations differ: dockyard, reservoir, something in between, but the surrounding finds are suggestive. You get warehouses packed with jars, many of them the standardized forms seen across the Indus world. You find seals, weights, bead-making debris, shell-working waste. This is not a sleepy fishing village, it's a node. Picture the coastline not as an empty blue margin on the map, but as a highway of water. Boats hugging the shore, sailing or paddling from inlet to inlet, timing departures to predictable winds and currents. Coastal communities who know reefs and shoals and sandbars by heart, who can read the colour of the sea and the movement of seabirds as easily as we read a road sign. Some voyages stay local, others strike out across the mouth of the Gulf of Oman, heading toward Dilmun, modern Bahrain area, and the ports of southern Mesopotamia. We can infer seafaring capability not just from harbours, but from what it would take to make this system work. To carry heavy cargo, stone, metal ingots, ceramic jars filled with oil, grain, or perhaps sesame, you need vessels with real capacity. To navigate overnight or out of sight of land, you need knowledge of stars, weather, and seasonal patterns. To manage risk, you need relationships, coastal waypoints where ships can resupply, repair, and wait out storms. Direct evidence is thin, as always in this story, but it persists in little clues. Barnacle traces and salt-crusted residues in coastal installations hint at repeated contact with seawater. Distribution of specific jar types along Gulf sites lines up with what you'd expect from imported Indus containers. Some Mesopotamian texts mention Meluhan ships arriving with timber, gemstones, metals, and exotic animals. At least one inscription refers to a Meluhan interpreter, which only makes sense if people from that far-off land are present often enough to need translators. Tie all of this back to the cities, and you see why this trade web matters so much. Urban life on the scale of Harappa and Mohenjo-Daro isn't sustained by local fields alone. Cities like that are hungry. They devour stone for building and tools, metals for tools and ornaments, fuel for kilns, fine goods for elites, and bulk goods for everyone else. Long-distance trade acts like a pressure valve. It lets cities specialize, exporting what they're good at: textiles, beads, crafted shell, perhaps grain when harvests are good, in exchange for things their hinterlands can't provide. Trade networks also spread risk. If one region has a poor harvest, others might still produce enough. If a local source of copper is exhausted or politically disrupted, distant supplies can fill the gap. For centuries, this kind of interconnectedness can stabilize a system, cushioning local shocks by allowing cities to draw on wider horizons. But there's a catch. The more deeply cities plug into long-distance trade, the more they depend on the continued health of that network. Caravans don't cross deserts if wells dry up. Coastal shipping routes falter if sea levels shift, storms intensify, or key ports become unusable. River transport becomes unpredictable when channels silt up. Flood regimes change, or water becomes too shallow for loaded boats. In a world where climate is not a slow backdrop but an active, shifting force, those neat lines we draw on maps, river routes, caravan tracks, sea lanes, are fragile. Dry up a river arm here, push a coastline back there, scramble one key pass over a mountain range, and what was once a smooth flow of goods becomes a series of bottlenecks and dead ends. A city that has built its crafts, its diet, maybe even its social prestige on things brought from afar, suddenly finds that afar has become unreachable, or at least much harder to reach. For the Indus cities, that vulnerability is going to matter, because the very same network that fed their workshops, stocked their warehouses, and linked them to distant lands will, under the pressure of shifting monsoons and wandering rivers, start to fray. And when that happens, the problem isn't just about losing pretty beads and exotic stones, it's about what happens to a whole urban system when the arteries that keep it supplied begin to close. Before we get there, though, we have to look at how these traders and officials tried to keep track of all this movement in the first place. They left behind thousands of tiny objects, seals impressed with animals and signs, that look suspiciously like tags, labels, or signatures. They hint at accounting, identity, and maybe even a writing system that has never yet spoken to us. To understand how a civilization can be so plugged into the wider world and yet so silent in its own voice, we need to turn to those seals, those symbols, and that stubbornly undeciphered script. Pick up one of those tiny square seals. It fits in your palm, maybe 3 or 4 centimeters on a side. It's carved from steatite, a soft stone that turns hard and creamy white when fired. On one face, a line of symbols marches across the top. Below them, an animal stands in crisp, confident profile. This little object is one of the most common things the Indus civilization left behind, and also one of the most mysterious. There are thousands of them. Some show humpbacked bulls with sweeping horns. Others show elephants, tigers, rhinoceroses, goats. Some have composite creatures, a so-called unicorn with a single long horn and a strange collar or manger in front of it. A few show humans or human-like figures, sometimes seated cross-legged in poses that later scholars can't resist comparing to yoga or meditation. Above almost every animal, in a neat band, are signs, curved hooks, fish-like shapes, tridents, grids, circles with attached lines, short stacks of marks that repeat from seal to seal. They're cut with such precision that even under magnification, they look intentional, standardized, almost like they were following a style guide. When you press the seal into wet clay, you get a mirror image, animal, symbols, a tiny framed picture of identity. So what were they? The safest answer is multi-purpose tools for marking people, goods, and perhaps even ideas. In Mesopotamia, seals function as signatures and security devices. You roll or stamp them over a lump of clay that seals a jar, a door, a bundle of documents. If someone tampers with it, the impression breaks. The image also tells you whose seal it is, and by extension, who authorized whatever lies inside. The Indus seals sit in a similar functional niche. We find them in houses, workshops, near storage areas, in what look like administrative quarters. We find sealings, lumps of clay with seal impressions, stuck to jar lids and baskets, or at least in the debris of what used to be those things. We find worn seals that have clearly been used over and over, their edges smoothed by fingers and pressing. It's not hard to imagine the scene. An official or merchant dips a little cube of stone into clay, presses, inspects the impression, hands the sealed jar to a porter. The animal might be an emblem, family, office, guild. The line of signs might be a name, a title, a formula like, from the warehouse of, or standard weight of. But then you hit the limit of imagination, because we can't read those signs. The Indus script is one of the great undeciphered writing systems of the ancient world. Unlike Egyptian hieroglyphs, we don't have a Rosetta Stone with side-by-side translations. Unlike cuneiform, we don't have tens of thousands of long texts that show gradual changes and make patterns obvious. What we have instead is frustratingly minimal. Most Indus inscriptions are short, very short. 4, 5, 6 signs is typical, 10 is long. The absolute outliers might hit 20 or so, but they're rare. The majority of texts fit comfortably on seals, sealings, tiny tablets, tools, potsherds, jewellery. That brevity is a big part of why the script has resisted decipherment. When linguists and epigraphers try to break a script, they lean on a few key things. Long texts that show repeated patterns, bilingual inscriptions with a known language, clear sign boundaries, and a sense of what the underlying language might be. With enough data, you can spot formulas, grammatical endings, proper names, loanwords. In the Indus case, almost every one of those is missing. There is no secure bilingual, no long narrative texts carved on temple walls, no royal proclamations with repetitive boilerplate to analyse. The signs sit in tight little clusters, changing order, repeating in ways that hint at structure but don't shout it. We also don't know for sure what language lies beneath, or even if the script encodes a full spoken language at all. Over the past century, people have proposed almost everything. Maybe the underlying language is an early form of Dravidian, related to Tamil or other languages still spoken in southern India. Maybe it's related to some now extinct branch of Indo-Aryan, or to a linguistic family we no longer recognise because it vanished along with the cities. Maybe the script is not really phonetic writing, but a system of non-linguistic symbols, mnemonic tags, clan signs, identifiers that don't map neatly onto sounds or sentences. Statistical analyses show that the order of Indus signs is patterned, not random. Certain signs tend to appear at the beginning or end of sequences. Some sign pairs are common, others never occur together. This looks a lot like what you see in true writing systems, where grammar and phonology constrain what can follow what. But patterned doesn't automatically mean full language. Think of license plates. They follow rules. certain letters in certain positions, then numbers, or think of airport baggage tags, 2 letters for a destination, codes for airline, date, maybe a checksum digit. Highly structured, definitely meaningful, but not something you can use to write poetry. The Indus inscriptions might sit anywhere on that spectrum, from compact, ultra-compressed writing that encodes names, titles, and bureaucratic phrases, to a structured, symbolic code tuned for administration and ritual, not for everyday speech. That uncertainty shapes everything we say about them. For example, one leading idea is that seals served as administrative tags in a system of accounting and control. The repeated combinations of animal plus sign sequence could mark ownership. This jar belongs to this household. This shipment comes from this workshop. This batch has been checked by this official. Another possibility dovetails with those vast trade networks. If you're moving goods across hundreds of kilometers, through way stations and across political boundaries, tags that identify origin, quality, or destination are extremely useful. An Indus seal could function like a brand logo plus serial number. When such a seal shows up in Mesopotamian cities, it might be attached to bales of cotton cloth or jars of sesame oil, proclaiming this is from Maluha, this is the real thing. A third cluster of theories focuses more on ritual and status. Some seals never show clear signs of use in sealing. They might have been worn as amulets, prestige objects signalling membership in a group, access to a cult, or authority within an institution. The animals could carry religious meaning. The signs could be short invocations, divine names, or ritual phrases. None of these uses are mutually exclusive. The same sign system might serve for accounting on one day and for blessing a ritual object the next. Modern scripts do this all the time. The alphabet you use to write a shopping list is the same one used to print sacred texts, legal contracts, and graffiti. So why, after a century of study, aren't we more certain? Because context keeps undercutting our confidence. We rarely find inscriptions in places where later literate societies love to put them. Monumental gateways, big public statues, temple walls recounting conquests and donations. Indus public architecture is almost obsessively plain. If there were grand carved histories, they've either perished, maybe painted on wood or plaster, or they never existed. Most texts are on movable, personal, or semi-personal objects. Seals, tiny tablets, copper tools, beads, pots. Things that travel with goods and people, not things that stand still and speak to crowds. That distribution suggests a heavily practical use, administration rather than literature, but without long strings we can't see the internal logic. Attempts to assign phonetic values to signs often end up circular. You can choose a language you expect, map signs to sounds based on tenuous parallels or rebus readings, and then discover that the resulting words fit your chosen language surprisingly well. It's intellectually tempting, but easy to fool yourself. Every now and then, someone announces a breakthrough. The Indus script has been revealed as Proto-Dravidian, or as encoding some specific set of rituals, or as something else entirely. When those proposals are put under statistical and comparative scrutiny, they tend to fall apart. The fit is too loose, the assumptions too generous, the predictive power too weak. So we're left with a script that is clearly systematic, clearly integrated into city life, but fundamentally mute. Does that mean we can't say anything about the society behind it? Not at all. Even without reading the words, the sheer existence of seals and standardized signs tells us a lot. It tells us there were people whose job it was to manage information, to track goods, to distinguish one workshop from another, to ensure that what left a warehouse and what arrived at a distant port could be linked. You don't invest in an intricate seal system unless misallocation, fraud, or confusion are real risks. It tells us there was a shared symbolic repertoire stretching across a huge territory. Seals from distant Indus cities use the same basic sign set and animal motifs. That implies communication, training, and enforcement. Someone in a port on the Arabian Sea and someone in a town deep in the Punjab could recognize the same symbols, read the same codes. That kind of standardization doesn't emerge from a loose collection of villages. It emerges from a civilization with norms, expectations, and probably institutions. It also hints at social differentiation. Not everyone would have possessed a seal. The right to stamp a jar or mark a document probably attached to position. Merchant, householder, temple official, estate manager. Children's burials don't tend to have seals. Adult burials sometimes do. That distribution suggests seals as markers of adult identity and role. All of this allows us to tell a cautious story. We can infer that the Indus world ran on recorded promises and tracked obligations, not just on memory and face-to-face reputation. We can infer that certain animals and symbols meant more than their literal forms, functioning as emblems in an abstract system. We can infer that communication about ownership, origin, authenticity mattered enough to be carved in stone and impressed in clay thousands of times. What we can't yet do is quote them. We can't say with confidence what any particular sequence of signs means. We can't read a single name, a single verb, a single explicit law. Their cities stand there with gridded streets, monumental drains, vast granaries, and a fully developed tagging system. And yet their own words about why they built any of it are locked away behind a code we haven't cracked. That silence can feel like a wall, but it also acts like a warning. It reminds us how easily the most literate, organized societies can vanish from the historical record if the medium of their writing doesn't favor survival, or if their script leaves no key for outsiders. It forces us to build our picture of the Indus world from bricks, bones, beads, and ceilings, rather than from royal boasts and epic poetry. So when we talk about their politics, their religion, their social hierarchies, we have to move carefully. We can sketch systems, we can outline probabilities, we can say this pattern looks like administration, or this cluster suggests ritual. But we can't yet point to a line of Indus text and say, here, listen, this is what they called themselves. And yet, even in silence their cities speak. They speak through standardization and planning. They speak through networks and seals. They speak through the striking absence of some things we almost expect to see. Because as we move from their labels and symbols to what they did not carve into stone or cast into bronze, another puzzle emerges, a puzzle about power, conflict, and how you keep order in a world of perfect cities built without, as far as we can see, an army. To get there, we have to ask a deceptively simple question. Where are the weapons? If you walk through the archaeological reports for the Indus civilization with a certain expectation in mind, you start to feel an odd kind of vertigo. You expect to see the usual cast of characters. Rows of daggers and swords in tombs, bronze spears stacked in arsenals, arrowheads by the hundred, helmets, shields, armor plates, city walls bristling with bastions, relief showing kings trampling enemies, gods handing over victory symbols, prisoners dragged by the hair. Instead, in the Indus world, you mostly don't. That doesn't mean there are no sharp objects. There are. Archaeologists have catalogued copper and bronze spearheads, blades, arrowheads, points that absolutely could pierce flesh as easily as they pierce animal hide. There are sling stones. There are rocks shaped and weighted in ways that invite the word projectile. There are long, sturdy wooden shafts that, if tipped and thrown, would become quite dangerous. But the pattern is not what you see in some of their contemporaries. In Mesopotamia, by the mid-3rd millennium BCE, you find carved stone stelae, where a ruler marches in layered ranks of soldiers, all carrying standardized spears, axes, and shields. You can see uniforms. You can almost hear the shouted commands. In Egypt, you get painted battle scenes stretching across tomb walls, chariots, archers, bound captives, rows of shields, piles of severed hands. The message is unmistakable. This state knows how to project violence. It wants you to see that, to remember it. In parts of Anatolia and later the Near East, fortresses sit on hilltops with massive glacis, arrow slits, multiple defensive walls. You can trace where battering rams might have gone, where defenders would have stood. In the Indus case, the evidence is quieter. Yes, some cities have massive perimeter walls. Mohenjo-Daro, Harappa, Dholavira, Rakhigarhi. Several major sites have big brick or stone circuits surrounding key mounds, but those walls don't always behave like clear military fortifications. Sometimes they enclose only small raised citadel areas, not the full extent of habitation. Sometimes they look as much like platforms against flooding or terraces for public buildings as they do like defensive ramparts. Their gates are often simple and straight, not zigzagging murder corridors designed to slow attackers under fire. You can't say they were never used defensively. A wall is a wall. In a crisis, you stand behind the highest one you have. But if you're used to the militarized architecture of later empires, you feel the difference. The same with the objects. The number of specialized, clearly military weapons is low compared to the size and duration of the civilization. Tools that could double as weapons are common. Axes, knives, chisels, blades that would work just as well for wood, meat, and quarrelsome neighbours. But purpose-built killing machines, mass-produced and stockpiled, are rare in the archaeological record. The burials reinforce this impression. In many warrior aristocratic societies, high-status graves glow with metal. Swords laid along the body, daggers at the belt, arrowheads at the feet, shields and armour arranged above. Weapons function as symbols of role and identity, not just practical gear. Indus burials, as far as we can tell, don't do that. Graves often contain pottery, beads, bangles, sometimes small tools, sometimes a seal. They hint at differentiation. Some people go into the ground with more and nicer things than others, but there is no consistent warrior package, no class of obviously military interments with elaborate arms offerings. And then there's the art. On Indus seals, tablets and carved objects you see animals, composite creatures, ritual postures, what might be processions. You see humans standing by trees, humans holding animals, humans in what look like ritualized positions. What you almost never see is combat. There are no clear chariot charges, no kings smiting enemy captives, no line of soldiers with spears, no glorification of battle or victory carved into stone to proclaim for millennia that this ruler defeated that enemy on this date. For a civilization that lasted centuries and spanned an area larger than ancient Egypt and Mesopotamia combined, that is unusual. Now it's tempting to jump from we don't see weapons and war scenes to they must have been peaceful. That picture of a harmonious, non-violent urban civilization humming along in rational order is seductive. It flatters our desire to imagine that complex cities don't have to run on coercion. But the honest answer is more complicated. First, absence in the archaeological record is never the same thing as absence in reality. Weapons can be made of perishable materials: wood clubs, wicker shields, leather armour, bows whose wooden staves and sinew strings rot away in a few centuries. If the metal parts are small and recyclable, they get melted down and turned into something else. If you don't bury people with their weapons as a matter of custom, you instantly lose one of the main ways archaeologists detect specialized arms. Tools stay in the settlement debris, get recycled, move from user to user until they break beyond repair. If you don't carve your victories on stone and hang them in permanent public spaces, if your communication runs more through seals, perishable banners, painted rituals, your wars don't leave the same kind of narrative fossils as an Egyptian relief. Second, even in societies where war is frequent, most sharp things are multifunctional. A bronze spear can be for hunting wild cattle, as well as for raiding a neighbour. A bow can bring down deer or humans. A fortified gate can keep out floodwater, wild animals, thieves and organised armies alike. So when we say the Indus world shows fewer obvious weapons, what we really mean is, compared to some neighbouring civilizations, the Indus archaeological record gives us fewer unambiguous signs of large, organised, state-centred warfare. Mass graves with trauma from blades and arrows, monumental inscriptions bragging about battles, fortified palaces designed like bunkers. Within those constraints, several explanations live side by side. One is that conflict took different forms. Instead of massive pitched battles between standing armies, power struggles might have taken the shape of raids, ambushes, hostage-taking, and economic strangulation. You don't need 10,000 soldiers in matching helmets to enforce a blockade on someone's trade route. You just need to control a key port or river crossing. Status competitions could have been framed more through control of resources, ritual roles, and access to water than through open war. If your leverage over your rivals rests on who gets to divert a canal or whose seals validate shipments, your tools of dominance are administrative and hydraulic rather than purely military. Violence is still there, but embedded in institutions, not always on the battlefield. Another is simply that we're missing parts of the puzzle. The Indus floodplains are dynamic landscapes. Rivers shift. Cities are buried under meters of silt. Archaeology has sampled only a fraction of all the sites that almost certainly once existed. A massacre layer here, an arsenal there, an inscription with some terrible boasting. These might lie under farmlands, modern towns, or unexcavated mounds. We also know that perishable materials played a huge role in Indus life. Wood, textiles, thatch, leather. If shields, armour, and many weapons were made from those, time would erase them almost completely. Stone and metal bias our view. A third explanation is cultural. Perhaps the Indus elites, whoever they were, did not choose to present themselves publicly as warriors. Their symbols of authority seem to cluster around animals, horns, headdresses, seated postures, and control over water and storage. If power is projected more through, I manage the flows of grain and water, then I crush my enemies, your iconography reflects that choice. That doesn't mean they disapproved of violence. It means they did not make martial imagery their primary political language in the surviving media we can see. Put those threads together and you get a cautiously framed claim. The Indus civilization, as far as current evidence shows, did not organize its cities around visible, glorified, large-scale warfare in the way some of its contemporaries did. Weapons existed. Conflict almost certainly existed. But armies, in the sense of permanent, centrally commanded, heavily armed forces whose exploits are carved into stone, are hard to see. And that leads us to a deeper question. If their cities were not ringed with obvious military fortresses, if their elites did not advertise themselves primarily as war leaders, if their decline is not marked by layers of burned destruction and heaps of battle dead, then what actually changed their world? Because we know it did change. By around 1900 BCE, many of those perfectly gridded cities are shrinking, fragmenting, or being abandoned. Long-distance trade fades. Seals and standardized weights become rarer. Regional styles proliferate. If we can't point to a conquering empire marching in with chariots and blades, we have to look elsewhere, to rivers, to climate, to disease, to economics, to the slow and sometimes invisible kind of pressure that can dissolve a civilization from the inside out. To follow that trail, we have to leave the weapons we don't see and turn to forces we can see written into mud, silt, and pollen. Because while armies may or may not have marched through the streets of Mohenjo-Daro, one invader definitely did: the changing sky. If you zoom out from the streets of Mohenjo-Daro and Harappa and look at a climate graph for the region, it doesn't look like an apocalypse. There's no single cliff where everything falls off. Instead, you get a wavy line. Up years, down years. Wetter centuries, drier centuries. Monsoon pulses that come in strong, then falter, then recover. To a city built on surplus grain and carefully timed planting, that wavy line is everything. The Indus world was, at its core, a monsoon civilization. Every year, sometime between June and September, winds drag moisture-laden air from the ocean up over the subcontinent. Those winds hit heat-baked land, rise, cool, and drop their cargo as rain. That pulse charges rivers, fills tanks and ponds, soaks fields. But the monsoon isn't a machine you can set your watch to. It shifts. Sometimes it arrives late. Sometimes it misses whole regions. Sometimes it parks over one river basin and skips the next. Sometimes it weakens, not just for a season, but for decades at a time. For a small village, that's brutal but simple. If the rains fail repeatedly, you move, pack up what you can carry, follow better grass, find a new patch of land with a slightly different rainfall pattern. For a city of tens of thousands, it's different. You're not just feeding one extended family, you're feeding a whole social machine. Brickmakers, bead cutters, seal engravers, priests or ritual specialists, administrators, carters, sailors, weavers. People whose entire lives depend on someone else's harvest showing up on schedule. In that world, monsoon variability stops being a boring phrase in a climate paper and starts being the difference between stability and slow-motion crisis. A slightly weaker monsoon doesn't necessarily mean instant famine. It means river levels drop a bit more often. Wells don't recharge as completely. The flood that used to irrigate your lower fields every other year now comes every fourth year. Your buffer shrinks. You can feel that in the mud. Lake cores pulled from ancient basins in northwest India and Pakistan show changes in the kinds of sediments and microscopic shells that settle out year after year. Certain layers say, deep, permanent water. Others whisper, shallow, seasonal pond. The chemical signatures of those layers, ratios of oxygen isotopes locked into carbonates, track how much evaporation was happening, how often fresh water flowed in. Put enough cores together and you get a picture. Somewhere around the late 3rd to early 2nd millennium BCE, several key regions of the Indus sphere start trending drier. Not a wall slamming down overnight, but a long uneven slide. Now, lay that over a map of rivers. The Indus civilization didn't just live with rivers, it wrapped its entire political economy around them. The big showpiece sites we all know, Harappa, Mohenjo-daro, Dholavira, sit near major river systems or on their ancient branches. Hundreds of smaller settlements studded the floodplains and interfluves, tapping seasonal floods, wells, and canals. But rivers, especially in low-gradient alluvial plains, behave like restless animals. They meander, they split, abandon old channels, carve new ones. They swing kilometres to one side over a few centuries. A branch that used to pass right under your city wall might migrate away, leaving you staring out over dry ground. Or the opposite. A minor channel can suddenly capture more flow, turning your quiet bank into a flood path that scours houses, fields and streets every monsoon. The Indus region was, and is, full of such shifting arteries. One of the most debated is the Ghaggar-Hakra, known in some ancient texts and later traditions as the Saraswati, a mighty river of memory that supposedly flowed between the Indus and the Ganges. On the ground today, the Ghaggar-Hakra is mostly a seasonal stream and a line of dry channels running through India and Pakistan. But satellite imagery and geological surveys reveal something more dramatic. A wide old riverbed, abandoned and reworked, running roughly parallel to the Indus. Here's where interpretation enters. Some researchers argue that in the early and middle phases of the Indus civilization, a large glacier-fed river, maybe a branch of the Sutlej, maybe even the Yamuna, flowed down this course, making the Ghaggar-Hakra/Saraswati a major perennial waterway. Others see a different picture. A river fed mostly by monsoon rain, not Himalayan glaciers. Strong during wetter periods, weakening or even breaking into disconnected reaches as the monsoon shifted and groundwater dropped. What is not in dispute is the archaeology. Along this dryish corridor sit dense clusters of Indus settlements, villages, towns, and some substantial urban sites. For centuries, people built, farmed, traded, and buried their dead along these channels. Then, over time, many of those sites were abandoned or shrank, while settlements along the still vigorous Indus trunk and in the eastern fringes shifted and sometimes grew. The sequence lines up suspiciously well with the environmental signals from lake cores and sediments. As the climate in some parts of the northwest became more arid and certain rivers lost dependable flow, people appear to have moved, not because they read a climate graph, but because the wells were drying, the floods were failing, and the soil wasn't giving them what it used to. Imagine you're an official, whatever that meant in Indus terms, in a city that depends on harvests from a wide hinterland. Your job, in part, is to make sure grain comes in, to temples, to granaries, to storerooms. That grain feeds city labourers, supports craft specialists, keeps trading voyages supplied, maybe funds rituals and public works. You probably don't tax in the way a modern state does, with written lists and receipts we can read. But the very existence of standardized weights, measures and seals tells us something like a redistribution system was in place. Now, year after year, the caravans from one sector start arriving a little lighter. Not empty, just under. Some jars that used to come full of barley are half filled. Some villages send fewer loads than before. People have excuses. The canal silted up. The flood failed. The well never refilled after last year's drought. You can flex for a while, dip into reserves, relax demands, shift shipments from better water districts to cover the gaps. But the climate doesn't care about your accounting. If monsoon patterns keep drifting, if that river branch that fed 100 villages has migrated away, if rainfall bands have nudged a bit east or a bit south, then a local shortfall can turn into a structural problem. The places you were depending on as surplus zones simply aren't surplus anymore. This is where rivers and monsoon lines tie into social fabric. When food security frays, so does everything built on top of it. Craft production slows because feeding a full-time artisan becomes harder to justify when everyone is anxious about grain. Long-distance traders find fewer surplus goods to ship and fewer safe harbours of trust and credit to rely on. People in marginal neighbourhoods may decide that rather than gamble on the next harvest, they'd rather try their luck closer to more reliable water. Archaeology captures that as a pattern of shrinking and shifting. At some big Indus cities, later layers show parts of the urban grid going out of use, while smaller, more localised occupations continue. In other regions, new clusters of smaller settlements appear further east and south, toward the upper Ganges plain, toward areas where the monsoon was still generous. It doesn't look like a panicked flight from invaders. It looks like decades and centuries of families making individually rational decisions in an environment that was slowly moving the goalposts. Some sites show careful rebuilding at higher levels, as if people were trying to keep pace with changing flood regimes, raising platforms, thickening walls, reworking drains to handle different water volumes. Others seem to have been let go, their bricks carted off and reused elsewhere. You can read those choices as negotiations with rivers that wouldn't sit still. When a channel shifted too far, maybe you stuck it out for a generation, hoping it would swing back or that rains would return. When it didn't, you moved your fields, then eventually your houses. If enough people did that, the great city on that mound would start to hollow out. From our vantage point centuries later, it's tempting to look for a single cause. The monsoon failed, the Saraswati dried, the climate collapsed. But the evidence on the ground resists slogans. Lake and marsh cores point to regionally varied trends. Some zones dried, others may have stayed relatively wet or even gotten slightly wetter. River sediments record channel migrations and avulsions that don't all line up neatly on one date. Settlement data shows staggered patterns of contraction and relocation, not a synchronized crash. What ties it together is not one big event, but the accumulation of stress. In a civilization so deeply tuned to seasonal water, its bricks, its fields, its weights and measures, its very street plans aimed at taming and channeling flow, even modest but persistent shifts in that flow would ripple through everything. At first, those ripples are invisible in the record. A few bad years, a well dug deeper, a new canal cut. But as they compound, they start tugging at the very systems that made the Indus cities feel so eerily organized. The redistribution of grain, the confidence that standardized measures actually meant something, the ability of central places to promise stability in exchange for loyalty and labour. Under that kind of environmental pressure, conflict doesn't have to show up as armies at the gate. It can show up as arguments over who gets the last reliable canal, whose fields get priority access to a shrinking flood, which community is asked to move so someone else can stay. Those tensions are hard to see directly. They don't fossilize like spearheads. What we can see is the outcome. New sites appearing where water still flows well, old ones winding down where rivers have wandered off, or rains no longer feed them reliably. And once you realize that the foundations of the Indus cities were being undermined not by battering rams but by shifting rain belts and restless rivers, another vulnerability comes into focus. Because tightly packed, carefully drained cities are not just sensitive to changes in water supply, they are also exquisitely sensitive to what happens when that water, once so carefully managed, stops being perfectly clean. Pack tens of thousands of people into a gridded brick maze, run water through every neighbourhood, and you don't just build convenience, you build an ecosystem. We tend to look at Mohenjo-Daro's drains and wells and bathing platforms as evidence of good hygiene, almost proto-modern sanitation. In some ways, they were. Compared to many later cities, the Indus centres look almost obsessively clean. But cleanliness is not the same thing as immunity. Any dense city, even one with well-planned drains, is a paradise for microbes. Respiratory infections move faster when households are elbow to elbow. Intestinal diseases spread more efficiently when everyone draws water from shared wells, uses similar toilets, and walks the same streets. Parasites thrive when human waste is concentrated and when domestic animals live right next to human sleeping spaces. The Indus people did a lot to manage that. They separated many houses from the main streets with small front courtyards. They tucked latrines into rear corners and directed waste into covered channels. They standardized brick sizes so walls and drains could be built and rebuilt with predictable fits. What they could not do was sterilize an entire city. Even the best engineered system has limits, and those limits start showing up in the quiet language of bones and teeth. Bioarchaeology in the Indus world is tricky. Preservation is uneven. Some famous mounds have produced very few well-documented burials. Others were excavated long ago with methods that wouldn't pass muster today. The sample we have is a sliver, but that sliver still whispers. On some skeletons from urban sites, you see lines and pits in the bones that never quite went away after childhood. Subtle thickening at the ends of long bones, porous patches on the skull, grooves on the inside of eye sockets. Taken together, those suggest episodes of stress, bouts of malnutrition, repeated infections, or both, interrupting normal growth. Teeth tell the same story in finer detail. Under a microscope, the enamel shows faint horizontal grooves, growth disruptions known as enamel hyperplasia, laid down like scars while the tooth was forming. Each line is a record of some childhood crisis that temporarily derailed development. You don't get those from a single bad day. You get them from periods when food, disease, or both became serious problems. Urban life makes that more likely. When a harvest fails in a village, families might scatter to relatives or new lands. In a city, people are locked into a place whose walls, drains, and granaries represent sunk costs. They may tighten belts, work harder, or lean on stored grain, but they also crowd into the same spaces, breathe the same air, and drink from the same stressed wells. There are more pointed clues too. At some Indus sites, soil samples taken from ancient drains and around habitation areas have yielded microscopic remains of intestinal parasites, eggs from worms that live in the human gut. They're not abundant enough yet to map an epidemic, and the data set is small, but their presence is telling. It means that even with carefully managed waste, some fraction of what went down those latrines and drains carried organisms ready to climb back up the food chain, into unboiled drinking water, onto crops fertilized with night soil, onto hands, onto shared surfaces. You can also see the toll in the joints. Several skeletal series from the broader Indus sphere show signs of heavy repetitive labour, spinal compression, joint degeneration, healed fractures. That's not unique to cities, of course, but in an urban context it likely reflects the constant demands of construction, maintenance and transport. Those demands matter because sanitation isn't a thing you build once. Drains clog, brickwork cracks, wells silt up or get contaminated. Public platforms and private courtyards need periodic clearing, or they turn into catchments for stagnant water and trash. When the climate was kindly and grain was plentiful, cities could probably afford a lot of maintenance. You have the food to support full-time brickmakers, drain cleaners, supervisors, people whose job is to keep water and waste moving where they're supposed to. As the environmental stress we talked about earlier ramps up, rivers wandering, monsoons faltering, that cushion shrinks. Imagine those same streets during a string of weak flood years. Grain coming into the city granaries is lighter. Local officials are juggling shortfalls. Households are more likely to be on edge about food. Labour that once went into rebuilding drains or relining wells now gets pulled into shoring up field walls, digging new channels, or simply trying to secure enough calories. Meanwhile, the physical city is ageing. The brick drains that were laid down a century earlier are a little more fragile. The cesspits that used to be emptied regularly are left a bit longer between cleanings. Roofs leak more. Courtyards pave over their wells and tap neighbours instead. Now throw flooding into the mix. We tend to picture drought when we think about climate stress. But in lowland river cities, bad years can mean the opposite problem. Ill-timed or more erratic floods. A monsoon that comes late but hard might send a pulse of water roaring through channels that haven't seen that volume for a while. Drainage systems built for a certain range of flow can be overwhelmed. Sewage backwashes into streets. Latrine pits overflow. Wells get infiltrated by surface runoff carrying whatever was lying in alleyways. Standing water, trapped in low spots behind collapsed walls in half-maintained drains, becomes a breeding ground for mosquitoes and other vectors. It also becomes a mixing bowl for whatever microbes are hanging around, from human waste, animal pens, decaying organic trash. The Indus engineers knew water was dangerous as well as precious. The raised platforms, the slope of streets, the proliferation of drains all testify to that awareness. But no city system is perfect, and no inspection regime is immune to budget cuts, especially when the budget is surplus grain and available hands. In a good year, you dig out the drains before the monsoon hits. In a bad year, you're late. Maybe several neighbourhoods clean theirs, a few poorer quarters don't. Water behaves accordingly. From our vantage point, we can't point to a particular skeleton and say, this person died in the summer diarrhea outbreak of 1850 BCE. The evidence just isn't that fine-grained yet, and preservation biases are brutal. What we can say is that in multiple Indus populations, especially in urban or proto-urban settings, there are signs of childhood growth disruptions consistent with periodic stress. Healed lesions on bones that can be associated with chronic infections. Dental wear and caries patterns that hint at carbohydrate-heavy diets. Maybe more reliance on stored grains when fresh produce was scarce. Occasional parasite indicators in sediments associated with human waste. None of these individually scream plague. Together they're more like a background hum, the constant companion of dense settlement. And that's where fragility creeps in. Not as a single deadly epidemic, but as a rising baseline of vulnerability. Think about the compounding effects. A slightly weaker monsoon means more irregular grain supplies. More irregular grain supplies mean more nutritional stress, especially for children. Nutritional stress dulls immune responses. A city whose inhabitants are marginally underfed for a few seasons in a row is a city where ordinary gastrointestinal bugs can become killers. Now layer in maintenance fatigue. As climate and economic pressures bite, the workforce available for public work shrinks or is redirected. The drains don't get quite the same attention. Wells aren't monitored as diligently. Small problems, hairline cracks, minor blockages, shallow pools, multiply. Each of those is a tiny increase in disease risk. Each outbreak, even if it doesn't leave a dramatic archaeological fingerprint, chips away at the energy of the population. Fewer healthy adults means less labour for the harvest, for transport, for rebuilding, which in turn makes it harder to keep the systems running that prevent the next outbreak. That kind of feedback loop doesn't produce Hollywood-style collapse. It produces sag, a city that slowly loses its edge. Workshops missing a generation of skilled hands because childhood illness culled or stunted them. Neighbourhoods where families quietly move out after a bad run of fevers. Administrators who find themselves firefighting constantly, rerouting supplies, organising repairs after another inconvenient flood, rather than planning grand new projects. From the outside, centuries later, what we see is patchy. Some streets in late phases of Mohenjo-Daro look less carefully maintained than earlier ones. Certain areas seem to have been abandoned while others were still occupied. In some city layers you find more hasty repairs, cruder construction plugged into once elegant layouts. Is that proof of sanitation failure and disease spirals? No. Too many other factors are in play, and the sample is too small to treat any single pattern as decisive. But when you place those hints alongside what we know about how dense pre-modern cities behave in general, a plausible picture emerges. Indus urban life operating close to the edge of what its water and waste systems could handle, and gradually slipping over that edge as environmental and economic conditions eroded the margins. The irony is sharp. The very things that made these cities feel so advanced, the standardized bricks, the aligned streets, the carefully channeled water, also meant they were highly tuned systems. Highly tuned systems perform beautifully within their design envelope. They also tend to fail not with a single snap, but with a series of small, compounding misalignments. A maintenance budget shaved here, a drain left uncleared there. 3 weak monsoons in a row, a particularly nasty season of gut infections among already stressed children. Over decades, those misalignments can nudge people toward different choices, to move to smaller, less tightly packed settlements, to seek out places where wells are shallower and floods more predictable, to rely less on giant brick machines and more on flexible, low-density living. When you line up the clues, from climate cause to river shifts to the quiet testimony of bones, it becomes harder to see the fall of the Indus cities as a mystery disaster. It starts to look more like a long conversation between water, microbes, bricks, and human bodies. A conversation in which the answers didn't come all at once, but in the gradual redirection of labour, trade, and trust away from the giant, carefully drained mounds and towards something else. To see what that something else might have looked like, we have to follow the money, or at least the goods, because as the health and maintenance burden of the big cities grew, the economic web that fed them was changing too. If you zoomed out over the Indus world at its height, it wouldn't look like a handful of isolated city-states. It would look like circuitry. Big urban nodes, Mohenjo-Daro, Harappa, Dholavira, Rakhigarhi, glowing where tens of thousands lived and worked. Smaller towns and villages scattered around them, each plugged into the grid. Raw materials flowing in, finished goods flowing out. Ideas, styles, and standards humming along the lines. That circuitry depended on one simple rule. Predictability, not perfection, not abundance every year. Just enough regularity that a potter in one town could count on getting the same fine clay from the same area most seasons. That a brickmaker could assume the usual fuel would arrive from the countryside. That a weaver could expect metal tools from some workshop hundreds of kilometres away, and that the workshop could expect copper ore from an even more distant mine. Urban life is specialisation held together by trust in the future. If you make beads for a living, you're not growing all your own grain, cutting all your own firewood, or digging your own copper. You're trusting that other people in other places will keep doing their part. So what happens when that trust starts to fray? Archaeologists can't watch the moment a caravan fails to arrive or a contract goes bad, but we can see the fingerprints of disruption in the things people left behind. One of the clearest is in the materials themselves. In earlier urban phases, Indus crafts looked like the output of a finely tuned system. Steer-tight beads, those little white or grey soapstone cylinders, are carefully drilled and fired into a hard, almost glassy state. The lengths and diameters are so consistent that some sets practically function as measurement units. Standardized weights show up across widely separated sites, following the same underlying ratio system. Seals carved from specific stones with a familiar repertoire of animal motifs and symbol clusters pop up from the coast to the foothills. Even the bricks we talked about earlier fit a consistent proportion rule, the famous 1 to 2 to 4 ratio. That level of standardization doesn't happen by accident. It's the mark of stable training traditions, shared specifications, and reliable supply chains. Later on, the tune changes. In several regions, the bricks drift away from that 1 to 2 to 4 ideal. You start seeing blocks with different proportions or mixed sizes on the same site. Some weights deviate from earlier norms. The once-tight metrology system loosens. Bead production shifts too. The most technically demanding types, like the long, slender carnelian beads that required multiple heating and drilling stages, become rarer in some late contexts. Simpler forms, or beads made from easier-to-work stones, show up instead. You can read that in a few different ways. Maybe the old masters died with fewer apprentices. Maybe communities no longer had the spare grain to support full-time specialists. Maybe the raw materials, specific stones from specific hills, or high-quality timber for kilns, weren't coming through in the same way. Whatever the mix of causes, the pattern is consistent with strain in the network. Think about shell. Early on, Indus artisans were importing marine shells from the Makran coast and Gujarat, hundreds of kilometers away, and turning them into beautifully standardized bangles and inlays. Those shells needed to travel inland along routes that also carried fish, salt, bitumen, maybe even ideas about ritual and status. When those coastal interior ties weaken even a little, you'd expect inland workshops to either change their product lines, downgrade to local materials, or shut down. We do see shifts. In some inland sites, shell items decline while bone, clay, or cheaper stone substitutes appear. It's a quiet signal, but it speaks to the same underlying issue. The machine isn't getting all the parts it used to, and that's where the dependence of cities on predictable flows becomes brutal. An Indus city isn't just bricks and drains. It's a constant choreography of movement. Grain coming in from fields and villages to feed non-farm labour. Firewood and dung fuels coming into power kilns, hearths, metalworking furnaces. Raw stone and ore coming in to feed bead makers, smiths, and seal carvers. Finished goods going out to pay farmers, to trade with distant regions, to sustain the prestige of whoever is orchestrating all this. Remove or destabilize any major stream in that choreography, and the whole rhythm changes. If grain deliveries become erratic because monsoons are fickle or river channels have shifted, something the climate and geomorphology evidence strongly suggest for the late Indus period, urban households feel it first. The ability to support full-time specialists shrinks. People hedge their bets. Artisans spend more time in fields. Fields get less skilled attention. Overall yields wobble further. If fuel supplies thin out, brick kilns are harder to keep going. That's not just an inconvenience. It means every repair costs more in labour and risk. Why rebuild that collapsed wall with fired bricks when you can patch with mud and scrap? Why maintain those huge platforms when a smaller, cheaper one will do for a reduced population? You see the logic of triage start to creep into the archaeological record. Recycling of older bricks, more ad hoc constructions, pockets of careful planning surrounded by more casual building. Metal is an even sharper indicator. Copper and bronze in the Indus world likely flowed in through long-distance routes from places like Rajasthan, Baluchistan, and maybe further afield. When those lines blur, because of political changes in the highlands, local resource depletion, or shifting trade priorities, urban metalworking has to adapt. We see less uniformity in certain tool types, increased use of local ores where identifiable, and perhaps more repair and reuse of old metal. Again, not a smoking gun, but a consistent drift from highly integrated craft economies toward more patchwork, regional patterns. At the same time, something else is happening in the landscape. The map of settlement itself is changing. Late in the Indus sequence, large urban centres show signs of contraction. Some neighbourhoods abandoned, others repurposed, streets partially built over. Yet out in the countryside, smaller sites proliferate. New villages, small towns, regional centres pop up in areas that had been lightly used or differently organised before. Styles fragment with them. Pottery that once followed a widely shared repertoire of shapes and decorations starts to diverge. In one region, you get certain painted motifs. In another, you see different shapes or surface treatments. Some emblematic Indus items, like standardised stamp seals, become rarer in many of these smaller settlements, replaced by more local tokens, tablets, or nothing at all. To many researchers, this looks like decentralisation, not a civilization smashed overnight, but a system slowly reconfiguring itself away from giant hyper-connected cities and toward more modest, regionally distinct communities. From inside that process, it might not have felt like collapse at all. Imagine you're a farmer on the edge of one of these cities. For generations, your grain has flowed along a familiar path, to local storehouses, to urban granaries, to pay for beads, tools, and the intangible benefits of being linked to the big city. Now the floods are erratic. A few bad health years have cut into your household's labour. Officials from the city still want their share, but the goods coming back feel thinner. The drains in your quarter are less well maintained. Rumours spread of better, fresher lands a little further from the river's unpredictable course. At some point the calculus tips. Why keep tying yourself to a city that can no longer reliably buffer you against bad years? Why not move with your kin group to that higher ground, that new canal cut, that emerging village where you can build in a less rigid pattern, closer to your own wells and fields? From the perspective of urban archaeologists a few thousand years later, that looks like abandonment. From your perspective, it might look like prudence. The same goes for craftspeople. If orders from big urban workshops dry up, but smaller regional markets open, you adjust. You shift from making standardized, export-oriented objects to catering to local tastes. Your forms become more idiosyncratic. Your use of materials reflects what's actually reachable over a few days' walk, not what some distant caravan used to bring. Over time, those millions of small decisions, by farmers, potters, bead makers, herders, local leaders, add up to a new map of connections. Less long-distance integration, more local loops, fewer goods moving from one end of the Indus world to the other, more staying within a single valley or sub-region. The old network doesn't explode, it unravels, knot by knot, strand by strand. That's why so many scholars today lean away from sudden catastrophe stories for the Indus decline and toward models of social and economic reorganization. Yes, climate stress and river shifts played major roles. Yes, disease and maintenance fatigue in the big cities likely amplified the strain, but the archaeological signals, changing craft traditions, drifting standards, proliferating small sites, regional stylistic divergence, fit a long, uneven transition better than a single apocalyptic moment. A highly centralized, tightly standardized urban system is incredibly powerful when conditions are right. It can coordinate resources, smooth over local shortages, and support dazzling levels of specialization. When the flows it depends on become less predictable, grain, fuel, labor, raw goods, that same tightness becomes a liability. Flexibility moves elsewhere, into smaller communities, more diverse local economies, different ways of organizing work and exchange. From our distance, we call that decline. From theirs, it may have felt like the world they knew, quietly rewiring itself, one trade route and one household decision at a time. And once those wires are rearranged, once people, skills and loyalties have rooted into new places, the great brick machines on the old mounds start to look less like the beating heart of a civilization, and more like oversized shells no one quite needs anymore. So where did the people inside those shells go? How did their ways of life mutate, carry on, or dissolve into what came next? To answer that, we have to follow them out of the cities altogether. If you follow them out, the trail doesn't end in a smoking crater. It thins, bends, and shows up again in places that don't look civilized enough to have once been part of one of the great urban experiments in human history. And this is where we have to be careful with the word everyone loves to use, vanished. Civilizations almost never do that. They don't evaporate like mist. They molt. Big, visible, easily labelable things. The huge brick platforms, the gridded streets, the standardized seals shed away. Underneath, the people, their languages, their habits, their favorite ways of cooking grain or braiding hair or arranging hearths. Those usually keep going, sometimes for centuries. With the Indus, the molting seems to have gone in a few main directions. One is geographical. As some of the great cities in the core Indus basin contract or are abandoned, we see more and more sites popping up further east into what's now eastern Punjab, Haryana, western Uttar Pradesh, even the Ganges-Yamuna Doab. Larger urban hubs like Harappa and Mohenjo-Daro lose population. Meanwhile, mid-sized towns and villages increase in number in the upper and eastern parts of the old Indus sphere. From a satellite view, it's like watching the light dim in a few big bulbs while dozens of smaller ones flicker on across a wider area. To many archaeologists, this looks like a long-term drift toward the east, and towards smaller, more dispersed settlements as people track water and opportunity. Part of that is probably climate and rivers. As the monsoon weakened and some river systems in the western Indus zone became more erratic or shifted course, land that used to be prime alluvial real estate became either too risky or outright uninhabitable for the kind of dense, organised urbanism the Indus had perfected. Further east, some regions may have offered more consistent rainfall, more reliable groundwater, or new floodplains worth the gamble. You don't need a catastrophic invasion or a sweeping plague to explain why generations of farmers and herders decide to move a little upstream, or over the next divide, or closer to a new perennial channel. You just need families making the same pragmatic choice, over and over. Another direction of change is social and economic. The big cities had been engines for hyper-specialization. When those engines stall, people don't stop knowing how to work stone, clay, shell, and metal. They just start doing it for different markets and with different constraints. In those post-urban villages and small towns, we still see beads. We still see bangles, we still see copper tools, terracotta figurines, decorated pottery. But the feel shifts. Instead of tight pan-regional standardization, you get more regional flavors. Similar forms show up with small twists, a slightly different way of painting a pot, a new favorite animal motif, a local variant of a classic Indus shape. Some classic Indus technologies keep going almost like nothing happened. People are still building in mud brick, often with bricks that look a lot like the old types, even if the famous 1:2:4 ratio isn't obeyed with the same obsessiveness. They're still making certain kinds of storage jars, still planning houses around courtyards, still using wells. You can think of these as continuity clues. They're like genetic markers in a population that has moved and intermarried and changed its customs, but still carries specific traits from an older lineage. Look at certain craft motifs. The so-called pipal leaf form that shows up in Indus art doesn't vanish with the cities, it lingers in later regional iconographies. Some basic horned or composite animal figures seem to echo forward into later South Asian mythic repertoires. The famous Indus unicorn, seal animal, might not show up in exactly the same form later on, but stylized bovines, powerful composite beasts, and specific ways of framing animals in rectangular spaces do. It's not straightforward one-to-one inheritance. We're deep into the realm of interpretation here. But it's enough to make a lot of scholars think in terms of cultural threads, not complete rupture. Even in the realm of technology that feels very urban, like weights and measures, there's a long tail. Standardized weights in later South Asian contexts sometimes use size series and ratio schemes that look suspiciously like distant cousins of Indus metrology. Whether that's direct inheritance or convergent evolution is debated, but the continuity hypothesis isn't outlandish. And then there are the little things that almost never make it into grand narratives. Ways of building hearths, preferred grain crops, specific combinations of wheat and barley, the use of certain millets, the continued presence of zebu cattle, of particular sheep and goat morphologies, of water management features tuned to monsoon rhythms. Those mundane agricultural household details show a lot of inertia across the supposed line between Indus and post-Indus. So if much of the population didn't die in some massive catastrophe, and if a lot of their practices quietly persisted, Why did so many stories for so long talk about destruction and disappearance? Here's where we hit the contested theories. For much of the 19th and 20th centuries, especially under colonial scholarship, a favourite story went like this. The Indus civilization was overwhelmed by invading Indo-Aryan tribes sweeping down from the northwest, bringing new languages, new gods, and a more dynamic culture that replaced a tired, rigid urban system. The evidence for that dramatic replacement? Initially, not much. A few skeletons in tricky archaeological contexts were overinterpreted as massacre victims. Later Vedic texts, composed centuries after the Indus urban phase, were read as more or less literal historical accounts of violent conquest. The fact that the Indus script wasn't yet deciphered made it easy to project external narratives onto their silence. As excavation techniques improved and radiocarbon dating came online, that clean conquest story started to fray. The timing didn't line up neatly. The decline of major Indus urban centres appears to stretch over several centuries and seems underway before we see clear archaeological signatures associated with later Indo-Aryan material cultures. Many of the small late Indus sites don't show burn layers, mass graves, or widespread destruction horizons. They look more like they were lived in, modified, and sometimes gently abandoned, not wiped out. In recent decades, most specialists have moved toward models where the arrival and spread of Indo-Aryan speaking groups is real but gradual, overlapping with local populations with plenty of interaction, borrowing and mixture rather than simple replacement. Language shifts can happen without genocide. Elite groups can impose new ritual systems over older settlement bases. Old city mounds can become sacred places in new cosmologies. People can adopt new deities and chants, while still farming the same fields their great-grandparents did. So instead of a single invasion event explaining everything, researchers now tend to see a whole stack of processes: climate variability, river reorganization, internal economic stresses, disease landscapes in dense cities, gradual migrations within South Asia, and later waves of incoming groups from the northwest and elsewhere. Some of these processes start before the big cities are fully gone. Others continue long after. This layered view also helps revisit that original paradox: how a civilization that left so few weapons and fortresses could still come to an end. If you imagine the only way a city dies is by being sacked, the lack of spearheads and battle murals is baffling. But if urban decline is mostly about water becoming unreliable, fields salting up, trade routes bending away, disease dynamics shifting, and people recalculating where life feels most secure, then the absence of weapons is exactly what you'd expect. The Indus cities might have been relatively peaceful in the sense of not organizing themselves around warfare, not glorifying conquest in their art, not pouring resources into massive defensive walls. That didn't make them immune to the slow violence of climate change, of river avulsion, of epidemic disease in high-density environments, of economic systems stretched past their adaptive limits. Their end, as far as we can tell, wasn't a single event with trumpets and flames. It was a migration of focus, away from a few monumental nodes toward many more modest ones, away from rigid standardization toward regional diversity, away from inscriptions on steatite seals toward other, still mostly invisible ways of encoding memory and authority. From a distance of 4,000 years that ends up looking like disappearance, we look at the massive mounds, see the last major building phases, then layers of silt and scattered later huts, and we say, they vanished. But if you follow the potsherds, the bricks, the wells, the cereals, the cattle, if you track the motifs, the patterns of settlement, the stubborn cling of certain technologies, a different sentence emerges. The cities ended, the civilization changed address. People carried pieces of Indus life into new landscapes, mixed them with incoming ideas, and over many generations turned them into something we label with different names: painted greyware cultures, early Vedic communities, the seeds of later North Indian states. The vanishing is partly an illusion created by where we choose to look and what we choose to count as civilization. We count seals and great baths and gridded streets, and when those go quiet, we write collapse. We rarely count the continuity sitting in village layouts, in irrigation tricks, in craft lineages, in ritual gestures that no text ever bothered to describe. To really understand what happened after the last great drains of Mohenjo-Daro clogged and cracked, we have to expand that definition. Because the lessons of the Indus aren't only about how you build perfect cities, they're also about what survives after the bricks stop being laid in straight lines. So what do we actually walk away with from these perfect cities, besides a sense of frustration that they won't answer us directly? Start with what we can see most clearly. The layout alone is a manifesto. Repeatedly, across hundreds of kilometres, you get settlements where somebody has thought very hard about how space should work. Orthogonal street grids, often aligned to cardinal directions or to reasonably consistent bearings. Main streets broad enough for traffic, side lanes narrower, all of it forming a kind of urban skeleton that could be replicated, adjusted, extended. This isn't the organic sprawl you get when houses just accrete around a hilltop or a shrine. It's geometry laid over mud and brick. Then there's the brick itself. The famous 1:2:4 ratio for brick dimensions sounds like trivia until you realise what it really means. Every builder, every kiln, every mason is working off the same mental blueprint. Change the scale, keep the proportions, and everything fits. Walls, corners, platforms, wells. You get modularity centuries before anyone is talking about modular design. Add water to that. Not just the great bath at Mohenjo-Daro, which is flashy and gets all the attention, but the boring parts, street-side drains, soak pits, inspection covers, graded lanes that slope so water actually goes somewhere, rather than just sitting and rotting. Household bathrooms with carefully laid brick floors, plastered for waterproofing, tied into covered drains that lead out into larger channels. Wells everywhere. Private wells, courtyard wells, and neighbourhood wells. A city where getting clean water and getting rid of dirty water wasn't an afterthought, but a principle that shaped the whole layout. Under your feet you have a hidden infrastructure that rivals anything in the ancient world. On top of that you see a level of everyday standardization that is honestly unnerving. Weighing stones cut to consistent series, storage jars of specific repeated shapes, doorways and stair widths clustering within narrow ranges, beads drilled with astonishing precision, some using techniques that require an intuitive understanding of abrasives and rotation speeds. This is civic engineering that has leaked into craft, and craft discipline that has fed back into urban form. No king lists, no royal inscriptions, no giant statues of ruling elites lording it over everyone, and yet a city you can walk through without tripping into chaos. The lesson is hard to ignore. You don't need a visible emperor carved on every gate to build and maintain complex systems. You need norms, shared measurements, collective habits that line up across time and distance. That's the part that feels almost contemporary. A civilization quietly built on interoperability, bricks that fit bricks across regions, weights that balance scales in towns that never met, drain solutions cloned and tweaked to suit local conditions. It's like they were running a 4,000-year-old open-source project on urbanism. But then the silence hits. Because right at the core of how such a system would work, how decisions were made, how conflicts were resolved, how priorities were set, we hit the blank wall of the undeciphered script. We have hundreds, maybe thousands of short inscriptions. Beautifully carved seal stones, tags, sometimes pot marks. Signs that repeat form patterns clearly mean something. But we still don't know. Was this a full language with grammar and narrative, or a highly compressed system of names, titles, and commodities? Were these the signatures of merchants, the marks of households, the identifiers of temples or clans? Did the same script appear on perishable materials, palm leaves, wood, cloth, that are now long gone, doing the heavy lifting of administration? Or was writing itself something narrower there, reserved for sealing goods and invoking symbols, while most governance ran on oral agreements, memory, and ritual? We also don't know who exactly was steering all this. Were these city-states with councils of elders, merchant guilds that doubled as political bodies, priestly groups coordinating ritual calendars and water management? Was there a hidden hierarchy living in those citadel mounds? Or were those more like raised platforms for communal storage and ritual, not palaces in the Mesopotamian or Egyptian sense? We can infer complexity from the results: coordinated brick production, zoning that separates certain industries from housing, large granary-like halls, standardized weights. Those things don't appear and stay stable over centuries by accident. But absence of monumental propaganda means we have almost no direct window into institutions, no laws carved in stone, no victory narratives, no tax edicts, no oaths of office. For a system that handled so much, its inner workings leave almost nothing for us to quote. And then there's the part where it all slowly comes apart. We can line up some of the players on that stage. Climate records suggesting monsoon weakening and increased variability. Geomorphological studies tracing river channels that shifted, shrank, or dried, especially in the Gaga Hakra region, often associated with a lost mighty river. Archaeological layers showing gradual changes in diet, perhaps more millets, different mixes of crops, as water regimes altered. Urban stratigraphy where maintenance of big drains starts to slip, where major platforms get repurposed instead of rebuilt to original standards. Signs of trade links fraying, fewer long-distance exotic materials, more local clays and stones, a diversification of regional ceramic styles. Possibly disease dynamics that we can't see directly but can reasonably suspect. Dense populations, changing water tables, warmer or more variable climates all add up to shifting pathogen pressures. Layer onto that long-distance trade routes that might have pivoted. If Gulf networks tilted toward Mesopotamia through different intermediaries, or if maritime routes adjusted to new harbours, inland Indus hubs could have found themselves off the main arteries, their once perfect location now merely provincial. And somewhere in that mix, population movements, some internal, following better water, some from outside, bringing new languages, new ritual repertoires, new pastoral strategies. But if you're looking for a single smoking gun, a single year where it all breaks, the evidence refuses. The bricks go out of strict ratio gradually. The cities thin, some faster than others, over lifetimes. We can imagine a scene that repeats for centuries. A young family deciding not to rebuild in the cramped, increasingly dysfunctional old quarter, but to move a little downstream, where the soil is fresh and the flood pattern more predictable. A bead maker marrying into a village that doesn't need as many carnelian exports, but could use someone who knows how to line wells. A caravan that used to stop at one big city now splitting its route between 3 smaller markets. No invader smashes the grid in one blow. Life just flows around it. That, maybe, is the hardest lesson to absorb, because it undercuts both our favourite myths, the myth of the glorious, invulnerable city, and the myth of the singular, cinematic collapse. From the Indus, we get something subtler. You can have stunning foresight in planning and still be caught out by slow, compounding shifts you can't fully anticipate. You can build in brick and ratio and drain and standard weight and still be at the mercy of rivers that change their mind, monsoons that blink, microbial ecologies you can't see. But we also see the flip side. A system that looks rigid from a distance, bricks all the same, streets all straight, turns out to have a lot of quiet flexibility at the edges. When stress rises, people don't only cling to the old core until it explodes. They peel away, redirect, reconfigure their lives in smaller, more adaptable clusters. Urban perfection in one phase becomes a reservoir of skills, techniques, and habits that can be redeployed in a very different one. If there's a message for us in that, it's not "don't build cities" or "standardization is bad." It's more uncomfortable. No amount of engineering can freeze a world in place. The best we can do is design systems that can degrade gracefully, that can be disassembled into parts that still make sense outside the original master plan. Indus urbanism, judged by that metric, did surprisingly well. Its wells, bricks, crops and crafts kept making sense far from the shadow of the great platforms. Still, some questions won't stop tugging. What was it like to sit in an assembly in one of those cities listening to arguments about canal maintenance or grain storage in a language we can't yet hear? Did anyone stand up and say, "The river has shifted twice in my lifetime. Maybe we shouldn't keep rebuilding here"? How did authority work on the day a caravan failed to arrive, or a flood came higher than expected, or an epidemic swept through a neighbourhood built on the promise of cleanliness? Did they tell stories about their own origins, their own first city, their own perfect builder, stories that might still echo faintly in later myths we now read with no idea of their real age? We're left with a civilization that solves certain problems so elegantly that its ruins feel strangely modern, and yet kept its voice locked in a script we still can't read. Maybe that's why the Indus sticks in people's heads. It shows us that it's possible to run dense, complex cities without turning them into shrines to kings and conquest. It shows us that collapse can look, up close, like a series of reasonable decisions made by ordinary families under changing conditions. And it forces us to ask, very quietly, which parts of our own world are we over-trusting because they look so well planned? Which of our grids and systems feel permanent, but are really just temporarily well aligned with a climate, a trade pattern, a disease environment? If an archaeologist 4,000 years from now dug through our layers, what would they see as our perfect city moment? And what would they misread as a sudden vanishing that was really a long, messy molting? So I'm curious what you see in the Indus story. Do you think we're missing a big piece? A political revolution? A pandemic? A technological shift we haven't yet found? Or does the slow, multi-cause unraveling make more sense to you? If you've got a theory about how these cities worked, why they changed, or what their quiet engineering says about us, drop it in the comments. Because until we can finally read their script, we're all, in a way, co-writing the story of a civilization that built near-perfect cities and then walked away. So let's leave them there for a moment. Not in the instant of collapse, not at some imaginary last council meeting where everyone sighs and blows out the lamps, but in the long twilight that cities rarely get credit for. The grid is still under your feet, streets still meet at right angles, drains still hug their edges, some clogged, some still catching runoff when it rains. Wells still descend into cool darkness, their brick rings spiralling down like a calm engineered thought. Workshops have quieted, but a few kilns probably limped along long after the peak. A bead gets dropped in a lane, rolls into a crack, waits 3,500 years to be seen again. And the seals, those little carved stones and faience tablets, animals in strange compact poses, lines of signs that look like they're just on the verge of saying something you can almost understand. Their owners are gone. The goods they certified have rotted. The contracts, if that's what they were, have all expired. But the seals themselves sit in the dust and the fill and the collapsed rooms, still crisp, still sealed off from us by that unbroken code. In the end, that might be the most fitting image for the Indus. A civilization that built cities so meticulously that the ghost of the plan outlived the reasons for building it, and left behind its own passwords without leaving anyone to tell us how to log in. The drains keep their shape longer than the stories about why cleanliness mattered so much. The bricks keep their ratio long after the last inspector stopped checking. The seals keep their silence when the language that once surrounded them has shredded into 100 descendant myths that no one can quite trace. And we, thousands of years later, walk through those remains in our heads. We picture their markets, their arguments, their flood seasons, their evening conversations on flat rooftops. We imagine the moment when someone brushed dust off a newly fired brick, checked its proportions with a practiced eye, and nodded. There's something strangely comforting in the idea that careful work can outlast its makers. There's something unsettling in knowing that meaning doesn't always travel with the things that survive. If you've stayed with this story all the way to the end, you're part of a tiny modern echo of that old network. Scattered people connected by shared curiosity instead of caravan routes. So if you found yourself thinking about your own city, or about how we build and unbuild our worlds, take a second to tap like, subscribe to the channel, and leave a comment. Not just any comment. Tell me where you're listening from and what time it is there right now. Is it late at night in a quiet apartment, early morning on a commute, midnight with the lights off and your phone glowing like a tiny hearth? I love seeing that map of when and where these old stories land. If this kind of deep time mystery is your thing, and you want to wander even further back than the Indus, I've put a lot of these prehistoric threads together in a book about the strange forgotten bottlenecks and turning points that shaped our species long before the first brick was laid in Harappa. It's all about those moments when a few thousand, or a few hundred, or maybe just a handful of people made it through crises that should have ended everything, leaving quiet fingerprints in our DNA and in the scattered stone tools we dig up today. You can find that book over at sleepytimehistory.com. It's written to be something you can fall asleep to or sink into slowly, the way you'd wander through an ancient city at dusk when the heat finally breaks. Of course, no single book and no single video can close the file on a civilization like this. We're still one good decipherment, one lucky find, one surprise core sample away from shifting the whole picture. Maybe tomorrow somebody pulls a wooden tablet out of an anaerobic well lining with longer inscriptions we can finally analyse. Maybe some dusty box in a museum stores the key seal that shows a scene we've never imagined. Maybe all we ever get is what we have now: bricks, drains, streets, silent seals, and a lot of very human guesses. Either way, the mystery isn't a failure of the story. It's part of what keeps it alive. There will always be another layer to peel back, another connection to make between climate and craft, between genes and cities, between the way our ancestors adapted and the ways we're struggling to adapt now. So as you close your eyes tonight, or go back to your day, let a little piece of your mind linger on those straight streets under a vanished sky, on water running through covered drains, on a merchant pressing a seal into soft clay and trusting a system we can no longer see. And if you're still curious, stay tuned. Because the Indus isn't the only place where people built impossibly ambitious worlds and then slipped out of the frame. There's another ancient mystery waiting, one where the ruins are smaller, the clues are stranger, and the line between myth and archaeology is even blurrier. We'll go there next.